You know you've made an impression when the enemy stops calling you a man and starts calling you a weather event. The Soviets called him the White Death, which sounds like a heavy metal album, but it was really just one short Finnish farmer with a rifle and way too much patience. Back in 1939, the Soviet Union decided Finland looked like easy real estate. They marched in with 500,000 soldiers, tanks, and planes. Finland had forests, skis, and people who hated being told what to do. Among them was Simo Ehe, a 27-year-old farmer barely 5'3", who volunteered, grabbed his old bolt-action rifle, and quietly went to work turning an entire army into an urban legend. Now, when most people think sniper, they picture a high-tech scope and a snug hideout. Not Simo. He used a plain iron-sighted Mosin Nagant. Why? Because scopes could glint in the sunlight and give him away. And because, honestly, he didn't need one. He'd trained by hunting in the Finnish woods since he was a kid, picking off birds with one shot. To him, a Red Army soldier was just a bigger, louder pigeon. He'd bury himself in snow, pack it around his rifle muzzle to muffle the flash, and even put snow in his mouth so his breath wouldn't steam in the cold. Temperatures dropped to minus 40 degrees Celsius, minus 40 degrees Fahrenheit. Soviet soldiers would freeze if they stood still too long. Simo would lie motionless for hours, because that's how you become the stuff of nightmares. During the 3-month Winter War, his confirmed kills hit over 500. That's confirmed, not someone said they saw him shoot. That means bodies counted. Entire Soviet platoons refused to move in areas where people whispered his name. When propaganda officers couldn't find him, they started assuming he was a ghost. Eventually, the Soviets had enough and sent counter-snipers, artillery barrages, even airstrikes, just for him. Nothing worked. Until one day, he finally got caught. A Soviet soldier fired an explosive bullet that hit Simo square in the face. It tore open his jaw and left him unrecognizable. His comrades pulled him out, thinking he was dead. He woke up a week later, with half a face, alive, and reportedly asked when he could get back to the front. The war ended a week after he woke up. Finland survived. The Soviets called it a victory, but they lost tens of thousands of men at a lot of dignity. Much of it thanks to one snow-covered ghost with a rifle. Simo Ehe lived quietly after that, back on his farm, raising dogs, hunting, smiling with what was left of his jaw. When asked years later if he regretted anything, he simply said, "I did what I was told to do, as well as I could." Not bad for a guy the world once mistook for winter itself. Most soldiers went to World War II carrying rifles. Jack Churchill brought a sword, a longbow, and a set of bagpipes. And the crazy part, he actually won with them. Jack wasn't some random lunatic who wandered onto the battlefield by accident. He was a British commando officer, trained, disciplined, and apparently allergic to normal behavior. Before the war, he'd been a male model and a professional bagpiper. Then Hitler invaded Poland, and Jack figured the world could use a little medieval energy. He showed up to combat wearing a kilt, carrying a Scottish broadsword on his hip, and slinging an actual longbow over his shoulder. When his men asked if that was a joke, he just grinned and said, "Any officer who goes into action without his sword is improperly dressed." That's not a quote from a movie. He really said that. In 1940, during a night raid in France, Jack spotted a group of German soldiers creeping through the dark. He silently drew an arrow, aimed, and became the only man in World War II confirmed to have killed an enemy with a longbow, archery in a world of machine guns. Somewhere, Robin Hood nodded in approval. When he wasn't using medieval weapons, he led from the front like a man possessed. He'd charge into battle, playing the bagpipes, blasting Scottish marches while bullets snapped past him. His men said it was the scariest and funniest thing they'd ever seen, the sound of bagpipes echoing through gunfire. Germans didn't know whether to shoot him or run from whatever curse they thought was coming. During one raid in Norway, he stormed a Nazi position with just his sword and pistol, capturing 42 enemies and a mortar crew. When reinforcements finally arrived, they found Jack standing there calmly, sword in hand, like he'd just finished mowing the lawn. But the wildest chapter came later. In 1944, in Yugoslavia, his unit was overrun. Everyone else was killed. Jack, of course, was found sitting cross-legged, playing the bagpipes. The Germans captured him, probably because they wanted to confirm he was a real person. He was sent to a concentration camp, escaped, got caught again, escaped again, and walked over 100 miles through the Alps to safety. And after all that, he wasn't done. When Japan surrendered, Jack actually complained. If it wasn't for those damn Yanks, we could have kept the war going for another 10 years. That's right, he was mad the war ended because he was having too much fun fighting it. After World War II, Jack went on to train future commandos, surfed in Australia, and retired peacefully in England. He'd sometimes drive his motorcycle around town with a basket full of rocks to throw at streetlights for target practice. Jack Churchill was the last man to fight a modern war with medieval weapons, and somehow it worked. If courage and chaos ever had a baby, it would have worn a kilt, played the pipes, and shouted into battle, "Mad Jack reporting for duty!"
Some people struggled to let go of a breakup. Yasuo Onoka struggled to let go of World War II. While the rest of the world was rebuilding cities, Yasuo was still in the jungle, armed, starving, and convinced that surrender was a trick. Onoka was a young Japanese soldier stationed in the Philippines during the last years of the war. When Japan's empire started collapsing, orders got messy, radios went silent, and entire units were swallowed by the rainforest. Most soldiers either died or surrendered, but Yasuo? He decided he wasn't done. The emperor hadn't told him personally to stop fighting, so he didn't. At first he wasn't alone. A few comrades hid with him in the thick jungle, surviving on bananas, coconuts, and the occasional unlucky chicken. They lived like ghosts, moving silently through the underbrush, convinced the American troops were everywhere. Every airplane overhead was enemy surveillance. Every rustle was a patrol. They built bamboo shelters, repaired old rifles with wire and hope, and planned for a war that had already ended. Then, one by one, his fellow soldiers died, some from illness, some from gunfire, some from sheer exhaustion. But Yasuo kept going. He thought any message about Japan's surrender was propaganda. Leaflets dropped from planes said the war was over. He burned them. A radio left behind by villagers said the same thing. He smashed it. He'd seen too many tricks. To him, it was safer to keep believing the war was still on. For years, villagers reported seeing a wild man in tattered uniforms raiding their gardens. He'd sneak down at night, steal food, and vanish back into the green maze. Hunters found empty camps with neatly folded blankets and rusted bullets,
clear signs someone still clung to military discipline in the middle of nowhere. When he was finally discovered, years after 1945, he didn't come quietly. He was wary, half-starved, and didn't trust anyone. Japanese officials had to send his former commanding officer, now an old man in civilian clothes, into the jungle to find him. Only when that officer gave him a formal order to stand down did Yasuo salute, weep, and finally walk out. He'd spent the prime of his life hiding from a war that didn't exist anymore. Back in Japan, people didn't know whether to call him a hero or a tragedy. The newspapers called him a soldier from another time. He bowed to cameras, apologized for nothing, and quietly said he was just doing his duty. And you can't help but respect stubbornness. In a way, Onoka wasn't just a man lost in a jungle. He was a living fossil from an era when loyalty meant everything, even if it made no sense. For him, World War II didn't end in 1945. It ended the day someone finally walked into the trees and told him, face to face, "Soldier, it's over." Most soldiers hoped to make it home from war, but Hiroa Onoda just refused to believe home still existed. For him, World War II didn't last 6 years. It lasted 29. That's not an exaggeration. The man kept fighting until 1974. Hiro Onoda was a Japanese intelligence officer sent to the Philippine island of Lubang in 1944. His orders were simple: gather information, sabotage enemy operations, and never surrender. Not don't surrender unless, not wait for peace talks, just flat out never. So when Japan surrendered in 1945, Hiroa Onoda didn't get the memo, literally. Leaflets were dropped over the jungle telling the remaining Japanese troops to come out. He thought they were fakes. Newspapers followed. He called them enemy propaganda. Then a plane flew overhead blasting messages from loudspeakers in Japanese, announcing the end of the war. Onoda just reloaded his rifle and went deeper into the trees. He wasn't alone at first. 3 other soldiers were with him, and together they lived like ghosts, stealing food from villages, ambushing local patrols, patching their uniforms, and taking notes on the ongoing American occupation. Every few months, one of them would die or surrender, and Onoda would just mark it down as a casualty in his personal war diary. Over the years, he became a local legend. Farmers would whisper about the jungle samurai who burned crops and shot at police. Every rescue team that tried to reach him, he treated as an ambush. In his mind, the Americans had turned the Philippines into a massive theater of deception. Time moved on. Japan rebuilt. Men landed on the moon. And Onoda was still crouched in the jungle, polishing his 1940s rifle and waiting for orders. Then came 1974. A young Japanese traveler and explorer named Norio Suzuki went searching for him, saying, "I'm going to look for Lieutenant Onoda, a panda, and the abominable snowman, in that order." And somehow he found him. Suzuki told him Japan had surrendered almost 3 decades ago. Onoda didn't believe him, of course. So Suzuki went home, tracked down Onoda's former commanding officer, who is now running a bookstore, and brought him back to the island. That officer had to personally order Onoda to stand down. Only then did he salute, cry, and finally come out of the jungle. His uniform perfectly kept, his rifle still working, his loyalty unbroken. He'd spent half his life fighting a war that ended before he was 30. And when he finally got home, Japan was unrecognizable. Vending machines, skyscrapers, rock music. He said it felt like he'd time-traveled to another planet. But here's the wildest part. He didn't regret it. He said, "I became an officer, and I was ordered to fight. As a soldier, I had no right to quit." Hiroe Onoda lived the rest of his life peacefully, running a nature camp and giving lectures. But in history, he remains the man who fought World War II longer than almost anyone else alive, the soldier who refused to surrender to time itself. Every army hands out rations, food, ammo, maybe a little coffee. The Finnish army, they gave out meth. And one poor guide named Aimo Koivunen proved exactly why that's a terrible idea. It was 1944. Finland was still fighting the Soviets in what they called the Continuation War. Koivunen was a 27-year-old ski trooper. Picture a soldier gliding silently through endless white forests, pulling a 90-pound sled in minus 30 degrees centigrade. His squad was deep behind enemy lines when things went sideways. Soviet troops spotted them, and the chase began across the snow. For 2 days straight they skied, barely stopping to breathe. No food, no sleep. And the Soviets just kept coming. That's when Koivunen remembered something in his pocket, a tube of Pervitin, the military-grade methamphetamine Germany had generously supplied to its allies. The pills were meant to keep soldiers awake on long missions. You were supposed to take 1, maybe 2 if things were bad. Aimo Koivunen, running out of time and patience, decided to just eat the whole tube. That's 30 pills. Within an hour, his brain went from tired to techno-festival. His heart nearly exploded, his vision turned into a kaleidoscope, and his squad mates disappeared, not because they died, but because Aimo suddenly skied away from them at superhuman speed. When the others finally lost him, he was gone, zipping through the frozen wilderness like a hallucinating snow demon. For the next 2 weeks, Koivunen lived in a blur of adrenaline and confusion. He skied hundreds of kilometers alone, still thinking he was being chased, seeing enemies that weren't there, talking to invisible comrades. He'd wake up buried in snow with his skis still on. His food ran out. His ammo ran out. At one point, he stumbled into a Soviet camp, lobbed a grenade by instinct, and somehow escaped into the night. Eventually, he collapsed in the middle of nowhere. His heart was pounding at 200 beats per minute, and he'd lost so much weight he could barely stand. For nourishment, he found a raw egg in the snow, ate pine needles, and drank melted ice. He kept moving, partly from discipline, partly because his nervous system refused to shut up. Finally, Finnish rescue troops found him. He weighed 94 pounds, his pulse was still racing, and his diary later revealed he'd covered over 250 miles alone in the Arctic wilderness. When doctors checked him, they were amazed he was even alive. His body temperature was near hypothermia, but his heart rate belonged to someone sprinting a marathon. When reporters later asked him how it felt to overdose on meth in a war zone, Koivunen supposedly said, "Not recommended." And yet, he survived, went home, and lived quietly until his 80s. No superpowers, no lasting fame, just the legendary title of that Finnish guy who took all the meth and still won. In a world full of heroic last stands and tragic deaths, Aimo Koivunen's story stands out for one simple reason. He didn't die, didn't surrender, and didn't sleep for 2 weeks straight. Sometimes survival is less about bravery and more about pure, chemically enhanced stubbornness. If you ever feel underqualified for your job, remember Henry Johnson, a man who went to World War I with a knife, a few grenades, and enough confidence to make action movie heroes look lazy. Yes, technically it was World War I, not II, but Johnson's legend was so outrageous that it echoed straight into World War II military folklore. The U.S. Army literally used his story to inspire troops in the next war, and once you hear it, you'll see why. It was 1918, in the Argonne forest of France, the kind of place where nightmares get claustrophobia. Johnson served with the 396th Infantry Regiment, better known as the Harlem Hellfighters. They were an all-black unit in a segregated army, sent to fight under French command, because America's generals still hadn't figured out basic equality. But Henry didn't care who signed his paycheck. He was there to fight. One dark night, Johnson and another soldier were on sentry duty when they heard rustling in the trees. Not the kind of rustling that says, "bunny," the kind that says, "oh no." Dozens of German soldiers were sneaking through the fog to ambush their position. Johnson didn't hesitate. He tossed grenades like a kid throwing candy, then started firing until his rifle jammed. When the ammo ran out, he grabbed his bolo knife, basically a machete, and charged. The Germans expected 2 sleepy guards. They got a blur of rage named Henry. He slashed, punched, tackled, and screamed, wounded in the head, shoulder, and hand, but still swinging. When his partner was shot and dragged away, Johnson lunged after him, fought off more Germans, and pulled him back. Then, bleeding out and half-conscious, he stood over his friend and dared the enemy to come closer. By the time reinforcements arrived, the ground was littered with German weapons and bodies. Johnson had taken out at least 24 men by himself. He'd been shot 21 times, but refused to die until everyone else was safe. The French gave him the Croix de Guerre, their highest award for bravery. His own country barely said thank you. Back home, Henry became a brief celebrity, nicknamed Black Death and Dynamite Johnson for the sheer chaos he unleashed. But fame fades fast when the system's stacked against you. He returned to racism, poverty, and a government that refused him medical care for his wounds. He died young and broke, but not forgotten. Decades later, historians rediscovered his story, and in 2015, the U.S. finally awarded him the Medal of Honor. It only took a century, but justice eventually caught up. Henry Johnson didn't fight for glory. He fought because someone had to. He wasn't 10 feet tall, didn't have superpowers, and didn't carry a machine gun. Just a knife, a few grenades, and the kind of courage that rewrites history books. Some people start clubs. Jock Lewis started the SAS, the Special Air Service, and he did it by blowing up his own trucks. because apparently in his world, the best way to test an idea was to make something explode and see who was still standing afterward. Lewis was a Scottish-born officer who looked like the least likely madman in North Africa. Polished accent, Oxford education, clean uniform, the picture of calm British manners. Underneath all that, a brain constantly scheming up new ways to turn chaos into strategy. In 1941, when the British were getting thrashed by Rommel's desert tanks, Lewis and another legend, David Stirling, came up with something radical. What if instead of attacking the enemy head-on, we sneak in behind them and blow everything up? That simple, insane thought became the foundation of the Special Air Service. But back then, it was just a handful of guys with jeeps, explosives, and way too much enthusiasm. And Jock was the scientist of the group, a calm, analytical lunatic. He designed the Lewis bomb, a compact explosive that could destroy aircraft without leaving a crater the size of a swimming pool. He literally mixed the chemicals himself in old jam tins while sitting in the desert heat. Imagine a man in goggles stirring nitroglycerin next to a camp stove, muttering, "This'll do nicely." Their first mission was a disaster. Parachuting into the Libyan desert, half the team died or vanished in a sandstorm. The survivors stumbled through enemy territory, dehydrated, delirious, and hunted by German patrols. When they finally found one of their own supply trucks, it turned out the Germans had spotted them and were closing fast. Most people would flee. Jock Lewis instead said something along the lines of, "Let's give them a proper goodbye." He rigged his own truck with explosives, waited for the enemy to get close, and then blew the entire thing sky high, taking the pursuing force with it. It wasn't a suicide. He timed it just right, escaped the blast, and lived to tell the tale. The explosion gave his team enough time to vanish back into the dunes. That was Jock's genius. He thought like a madman, but planned like a mathematician. His obsession with precision turned desert raiding into a fine art. He trained his men to strike at night, hit airfields, and disappear before dawn, tactics still used by modern special forces. Sadly, he didn't live to see how big his idea became. A few months later, during another raid, his jeep was strafed by enemy planes. He was killed instantly. David Stirling later said, "Jock Lewis was the bravest man I ever knew and the real founder of the SAS." Today, the SAS motto is, "Who dares wins." But it might as well have been, "Who blows up their own truck first?" because that was Jock Lewis, polite, brilliant, and just unhinged enough to change the entire face of warfare. If Hollywood ever made a movie where one guy stands on a burning tank shooting at an entire German army by himself, people would say it's unrealistic. Except that's literally what Audie Murphy did. Murphy wasn't born into greatness. He was born into poverty in rural Texas. He dropped out of school in 5th grade to pick cotton and feed his siblings. When Japan attacked Pearl Harbor, he was 16, undersized, and desperate to enlist. The Army turned him down for being too short. The Marines said no. Even the paratroopers laughed him out the door. So he lied about his age, joined anyway, and somehow ended up being one of the most decorated soldiers in U.S. history. By 1945, 20-year-old Audie Murphy had seen more chaos than most people could handle in 3 lifetimes. But his legend was sealed one frozen afternoon in France. His unit was ambushed by hundreds of German soldiers and tanks, the kind of force that makes entire companies retreat. And retreat they did. Everyone fell back, except Murphy. He told his men to get to safety while he stayed behind with a radio to direct artillery fire. Then he noticed an abandoned tank destroyer nearby, already on fire and ready to blow. So naturally, he climbed on top of it, because apparently setting yourself on fire was optional in Audie Murphy's world. From that burning steel coffin, he grabbed the mounted .50 caliber machine gun and opened fire. He mowed down wave after wave of advancing German troops, dozens of them, then hundreds. Mortar shells landed around him, bullets tore into the tank, and smoke billowed thick enough to choke him out. But he just kept firing. He was wounded in the leg, bleeding, deafened by explosions, and still yelling coordinates into his radio like it was a normal workday. He held that position alone for almost an hour until the Germans finally gave up and retreated. When American reinforcements returned, they found him standing in the smoke, covered in blood and soot, refusing to leave until every last man was accounted for. He killed or wounded over 50 enemies by himself and saved his entire company. For that, he earned the Medal of Honor, plus every other major American combat medal available, and a few foreign ones too. When reporters asked him why he stayed behind, he just shrugged and said, "They were killing my friends." After the war, Hollywood tried to make him play himself in a movie called To Hell and Back. He agreed reluctantly, and the film became a massive hit. But fame didn't erase the nightmares. Like so many veterans, he carried the war with him for the rest of his life. Still, when people talk about impossible courage, the kind that doesn't make sense, the kind that burns and bleeds and still keeps shooting, they end up talking about Audie Murphy, a scrawny Texas farm kid who climbed on top of a burning tank and decided, "Yeah, I got this." Most people pick a career path and stick to it. Lauri Turney picked 3 different armies and fought in all of them: Finland, Nazi Germany, and later the United States. And no, that's not a resume mistake. That's one man's chaotic military odyssey that spanned continents, ideologies, and wars. Lauri Turney was born in Finland in 1919, a country that basically specialized in surviving impossible situations. By the time he was old enough to shave, Finland was already fighting the Soviet Union in the brutal Winter War. Turney joined up immediately. He was small, tough, and had the kind of determination usually reserved for angry badgers. In battle, he showed up like a ghost, leading ski patrols through snowstorms, ambushing Soviet convoys, and disappearing into the trees before anyone could fire back. His kill count got so high that the Soviets put a bounty on his head, the equivalent of about $650,000 today. His comrades said that if anyone deserved to collect it, it was Turney himself. But Finland lost territory and had to make peace, and Turney wasn't ready to hang up his rifle. So when Germany came knocking, saying, "Hey, want to join the SS and keep fighting the Soviets?" he basically said, "Sure, why not?" To him, it wasn't about politics. It was about revenge. The Soviets had invaded his country, and he wasn't done getting even. He trained with the Waffen-SS in Austria, led sabotage missions on the Eastern Front, and somehow survived. When the war turned against Germany, he went back to Finland, only to get arrested for treason because, well, joining Hitler's army tends to raise eyebrows. He escaped prison because, of course he did, fled across Europe, and eventually made his way to Sweden. Then he did something even crazier. he hopped on a ship to America. There, he changed his name to Larry Thorne, joined the U.S. Army, and, unbelievably, climbed the ranks all over again. He trained Special Forces soldiers, taught guerrilla tactics, and helped form what would later become the U.S. Green Berets. His commanders adored him. None of them cared that his Finnish hero used to fight in a German uniform. By the 1960s, Larry Thorne was back in action, this time in Vietnam. He flew dangerous missions behind enemy lines, leading small teams deep into Viet Cong territory. Then, in 1965, his helicopter disappeared in a storm. He was declared missing in action. For decades, his body wasn't found. When it was finally found, buried deep in the jungle, the U.S. military gave him a full hero's burial at Arlington National Cemetery. So to recap, he fought the Soviets for Finland, fought the Soviets again for Germany, then fought communists for the U.S. He's possibly the only man to serve in 3 armies, including one that fought the other 2. Lowry Turney didn't pick sides, he picked battles, and no matter which flag flew above him, he fought like it was personal, because for him, it always was. Some soldiers dream of making it home. Alvin Lawless decided to make Germany his new hunting ground instead. He escaped a Nazi POW camp and then stayed in enemy territory just to blow things up for fun. Lawless wasn't a superhero or a spy, just a tough-as-nails American pilot shot down over occupied Europe. His plane was hit during a bombing run, and he parachuted into German territory where capture was basically guaranteed. The Nazis tossed him into a POW camp. Barbed wire, guard towers, dogs, the whole cliché. Most people would focus on surviving. Alvin Lawless focused on getting even. He started planning escapes before the guards even counted heads. He studied routines, watched the towers, timed patrols, and made mental maps of everything, including where the Germans kept the tools. After a few failed attempts, he finally broke free one stormy night, crawling through mud, freezing rain, and barbed wire until he vanished into the trees. Now here's where most escape stories end. He could have found the resistance, hidden, and waited for rescue. But Alvin Lawless had other ideas. He decided if he was going to risk his life escaping, he might as well make it count. So he stayed behind enemy lines, alone, armed with a stolen pistol, a few grenades, and a chip on his shoulder the size of Ohio. He sabotaged German convoys, cut communication lines, and raided supply depots. At night, villagers whispered about a ghost in the woods, a man who struck and disappeared. When the Nazis sent patrols to find him, they came back missing vehicles, missing supplies, and sometimes missing men. He wasn't part of any organized network. He was a literal one-man resistance. One time, he derailed an entire troop train by planting stolen explosives under the tracks. Another time, he ambushed a fuel convoy and burned it to ashes, watching the firelight fade into the dark forest before slipping away like it was just another work shift. For months, he lived off scraps, slept in barns, and relied on locals brave enough to help him. His boots fell apart, his uniform rotted, and his hair grew wild, but he never stopped hitting the enemy wherever he could. When Allied forces finally pushed through the region, they found reports of an American saboteur operating independently. Commanders thought it was a rumor, until Lawless walked into camp, filthy, grinning and holding a captured German rifle like a souvenir. He'd escaped a POW camp and then turned the entire countryside into his personal revenge tour. His superiors didn't know whether to court-martial him or give him a medal. They gave him medals, several. After the war, Lawless went home and quietly disappeared from the spotlight, just another veteran blending into post-war America. But among soldiers, his story lived on. The tale of the man who refused to run, refused to hide, and decided that if he was going to survive behind enemy lines, he might as well make the enemy regret every second of it. Because Alvin Lawless didn't just escape, he made war personal. If James Bond had been born evil and German, his name would have been Otto Skorzeny. He was 6'4", scarred down his face, spoke 5 languages, and could bluff his way through enemy checkpoints like he'd invented confidence. Even Hitler called him the most dangerous man in Europe. And for once, Hitler wasn't exaggerating. Skorzeny was a master of disguise, sabotage, and chaos. But his legend began with one mission so cinematic it still sounds fake. The time he rescued Benito Mussolini from an Italian mountaintop fortress using gliders. It was 1943, and things weren't going great for the Axis. Italy had just switched sides, Mussolini had been arrested by his own people, and Hitler was throwing a tantrum large enough to register on the Richter scale. He demanded someone find his old buddy and bring him back. Enter Skorzeny, the SS commando with a flair for impossible assignments. Mussolini wasn't just in prison. He was hidden at a remote hotel on top of Gran Sasso, a mountain so isolated that you couldn't get there without a cable car or wings. So Skorzeny picked wings. He and a handful of paratroopers boarded silent gliders and crash-landed right next to the hotel. No parachutes, no backup, just gravity, luck, and a whole lot of insanity. They smashed down onto the mountain, burst through the doors, and found Mussolini sitting in his cell looking bored. Skorzeny, bleeding from the crash, reportedly bowed and said, "Duce, the Führer has sent me to free you." Mussolini smiled, because what else do you do when a Nazi superhero literally flies into your prison? And just like that, without firing a single shot, they grabbed him and took off in a tiny reconnaissance plane, barely big enough for one person. The pilot tried to say, "Sir, there's no room for 3." Skorzeny basically said, "There is now," and shoved himself in, and the plane somehow managed to take off from the mountaintop. It was the kind of stunt that shouldn't have worked, but it did. They flew straight back to Germany, Mussolini safe, Hitler overjoyed, and Otto Skorzeny instantly became a Nazi celebrity. From then on, he was the go-to guy for missions that sounded suicidal. He led commandos disguised as Allied soldiers during the Battle of the Bulge, sowing confusion behind enemy lines. He plotted assassinations, sabotage, and psychological warfare with the calmness of a man planning a dinner party. After the war, he was captured, tried as a war criminal, and somehow escaped, again. He fled to Spain, started a business, and allegedly worked for various intelligence agencies during the Cold War. Because of course he did. The man had more plot twists than an entire Netflix season. Love him or hate him, Skorzeny redefined what special operations could mean. Deception, speed, and sheer audacity. He wasn't just a soldier. He was a walking headline that refused to die. If history had a most likely to hijack his own movie award, Otto Skorzeny would have won it every time. Some people win medals. Charles Upham collected them like parking tickets. He wasn't loud, didn't brag, and barely talked about the war at all. But he's the only combat soldier in World War II to earn 2 Victoria Crosses, Britain's highest award for gallantry. That's the military version of beating the game on impossible mode, twice, without cheat codes. Upham was a farmer from New Zealand, the kind of guy whose idea of excitement was fixing fences. But when the war broke out, he swapped his tractor for a rifle and joined the 20th Battalion. From day one, he had a weird habit of being exactly where the danger was, not because he loved chaos, but because someone had to get the job done, and apparently that someone was always him. His first Victoria Cross came during the Battle of Crete in 1941. The Germans were dropping paratroopers like confetti, and Upham's platoon was outnumbered and outgunned. He crawled through machine gun fire to toss grenades into enemy positions multiple times. He got shot through the arm and shrapnel in his leg, but still charged a German truck, killed the entire crew, and dragged his men back to safety. Then, while bleeding and barely able to stand, he spotted another enemy machine gun nest pinning down his company. So he just walked toward it, calmly, tossed a grenade, ended the threat. Command wrote him up for bravery. His response? I was just doing my job. 2 years later, in Egypt, he did it again, but bigger. The Battle of Rawasat Ridge, 1942. His unit was surrounded, artillery was raining down, and Upham, now a captain, decided surrender wasn't on the menu. He took out multiple enemy positions using a submachine gun and grenades, personally captured dozens of prisoners, and led his surviving men to safety. When he finally ran out of ammo, he charged a tank with a pistol. He was shot, captured, and nearly died in a POW camp. His captors hated him so much they called him the most dangerous prisoner in Germany. They weren't wrong. Upham tried to escape multiple times, even once by jumping out of a moving train. Eventually, the Germans gave up and sent him to Colditz Castle, a prison for serial escapees, basically the varsity league of stubbornness. When the war ended, he went home to New Zealand, refused every parade, and went back to farming. When the government offered him money for his medals, he said no. When someone asked what he'd done to earn them, he shrugged and said, I didn't do anything special. That's the thing about Charles Upham. His heroism was so unpretentious it almost looked accidental. 2 Victoria Crosses, countless acts of near-suicidal courage, and not a trace of ego. He didn't fight for glory or fame or history books. He fought because it was his job, and he was really, really good at his job. If you ever think your life's been tough, meet Adrian Carton de Weert, the man who treated war wounds like minor inconveniences. He lost an eye, got shot in the face, had his hand blown off, survived plane crashes, and escaped from a POW camp. And when people asked how he felt about all that, he said, and I quote, "Frankly, I had a wonderful time." This wasn't a movie character. This was a real British general who seemed powered by spite and duct tape. Born in 1880 to a wealthy Belgian family, Carton de Weert could have lived quietly, drinking tea and attending polo matches. Instead, he decided bullets looked fun. He lied about his age to join the British Army during the Boer War, got shot in the stomach and groin, and came back for more. That set the tone for the next 40 decades. During World War I, he fought everywhere: Sudan, Somaliland, France. While leading an assault in Africa, he got shot in the face, losing an eye and part of his ear. They sent him home to recover. He complained it was boring and begged to go back. The army eventually caved, possibly because they realized arguing with a half-blind, one-handed commander was pointless. Then came another battle, another injury, this time a hand blown apart by artillery. Doctors wanted to amputate, but he got tired of waiting and ripped off his own fingers so he could return to the front faster. Yes, you heard that right. The man literally self-amputated so he could get back to killing Germans. He ended up leading troops through some of the worst trench warfare in history. When he charged through machine gun fire, his men followed. Because how do you tell a half-blind, one-handed commander no? For his bravery, he received the Victoria Cross, Britain's highest honor for valor. And he didn't stop there. Between wars, he served in Poland and China, caused diplomatic chaos, and collected more scars than sense. When World War II kicked off, most men his age were retiring. Carton de Weert, now in his 60s, volunteered again, naturally. In 1941, his plane was shot down over the Mediterranean, and he was captured by the Italians. They stuck him in a high-security prison for officers. Big mistake. He spent 7 months digging a tunnel and escaped, even though he was basically an antique Terminator by that point. When recaptured, his guards respected him so much they let him live comfortably, probably out of fear he'd eat the bars next time. After the war, he retired to Ireland, finally slowed down, and spent his final years fishing with one arm. When he wrote his memoir, he named it Happy Odyssey, because, in his words, frankly, I enjoyed the war. Adrian Carton de Weert wasn't fearless. He was beyond fear. He was the human version of try me, and somehow the universe tried and still lost. Should I be laughed at as a fool, I will still say it. War is meaningless. Those were the final words written by Kiyoshi Ogawa, a young Japanese pilot who went to his death with poetry in his pocket. He didn't shout patriotic slogans or cry for glory. He simply wrote about how beautiful life was, and then flew straight into a ship to destroy it. Ogawa was only 22 when the Empire called on him to volunteer for Tokotai, the special attack units, or what the Allies called kamikaze. He wasn't a brainwashed fanatic. By all accounts, he was polite, gentle, and loved literature. In another timeline, he'd have been a teacher or poet. But in 1945, Japan's war machine was collapsing, and young men like him were told that dying beautifully could save the nation. They were trained quickly, given a farewell feast, and encouraged to write letters to their families. Ogawa's was calm, heartbreaking, and stunningly human.
He thanked his parents for raising him, told them not to grieve, and wrote that he hoped his death might bring a little peace to the world. He even apologized for the trouble his death would cause. Then came May 11th, 1945, the Battle of Okinawa. The Americans had nearly taken the island, and Japan threw everything it had left into the sky. Ogawa climbed into a Mitsubishi Zero, his cockpit barely large enough to move in. Inside the plane was a 500-kilogram bomb bolted beneath him, a weapon he couldn't drop without dying with it. He took off with a group of fellow kamikaze pilots, all flying toward the USS aircraft carrier Bunker Hill. The ship's radar picked them up. Alarms screamed. Gunners opened fire. The sky turned to flame. One plane exploded mid-air. Another was shot down before reaching the deck, but Ogawa kept coming. Witnesses said his Zero dove straight through the wall of tracer fire, smoke trailing behind like the tail of a comet. He smashed into the carrier's deck near the fuel lines. The explosion ripped through the ship, igniting hundreds of gallons of aviation gas. Nearly 400 American sailors died. Ogawa, of course, died instantly. In the chaos of battle, his name was forgotten. But after the war, his letters were recovered, and that's when the world met the real Kiyoshi Ogawa. Not a mindless killer, not a symbol, just a boy caught in a machine too big to escape. His writing spoke softly against the noise of propaganda. Even as I die, I pray that someday people will understand one another. He didn't want to be a hero. He wanted the killing to stop. And that's the paradox of his story. A man forced to die violently, whose last wish was peace. When people hear kamikaze, they picture blind loyalty. But when you read Ogawa's words, you realize it was never about hate. It was about a young man who thought maybe, by dying, he could end the dying.
The phrase, "keep calm and carry on," might as well have been invented for Major Robert Kane. Except he wasn't keeping calm in an office during air raids. He was calmly blowing up German tanks while bleeding from the ears. It was September 1944, the Battle of Arnhem, one of Britain's most desperate missions. The plan, Operation Market Garden, was simple on paper and insane in real life. Parachute thousands of men behind enemy lines to capture bridges in the Netherlands before the Germans knew what hit them. Spoiler alert, the Germans noticed. Kane, a 32-year-old officer from the British Army's South Staffordshire Regiment, found himself and his men trapped in a small Dutch town, surrounded by tanks, artillery, and very bad odds. Most people would start thinking about surrender. Kane started checking his anti-tank gun. He wasn't a loud or showy leader. He had the calm tone of a man asking for tea, even while directing his men to fire rockets at advancing panzers. For days, the Germans sent in one tank after another, and Kane stood his ground every time. He'd aim, fire, reload, and fire again until one of the blasts went wrong. The recoil from the weapon ruptured his eardrums. Blood poured from his ears. Most soldiers would have been evacuated immediately. Kane just said, "I'm fine," and kept going, now half deaf, shouting orders he couldn't even hear properly. At one point, a tank was so close that its cannon was practically staring him in the face.
He crouched behind rubble, waited until it turned, then fired, point blank. The explosion was so massive that burning debris rained on him. When smoke cleared, he was covered in soot, but still alive, brushing ash off his uniform like he'd spilled his drink. Over the next several days, Kane destroyed multiple tanks, fought off infantry, and held his position while wounded soldiers around him were being carried away. His men said he never lost his composure, even when his weapon malfunctioned. When one rocket launcher jammed, he calmly put it down, picked up another, and kept firing, as if changing golf clubs. When reinforcements finally arrived, the area was a wasteland of burned-out vehicles, craters, and exhausted survivors. Kane was still there, limping, ears bleeding, uniform torn to ribbons. He refused medical treatment until every one of his men was seen first. For his unbelievable composure and sheer stubbornness, he received the Victoria Cross, Britain's highest military honor. The official citation described him as cool and determined, which is polite British code for, "This man is insane." After the war, he went back to civilian life, quiet, humble, and almost embarrassed by the attention. His neighbors never even knew about his medal until after he died. Robert Kane wasn't fueled by rage or adrenaline, just duty, discipline, and a calm defiance that borders on comedy. He didn't see himself as a hero. He just thought someone had to hold the line, and when everything was collapsing, he did, politely, stubbornly, and with a bleeding smile.
He didn't look like a hero. No cigar, no swagger, no movie star jawline. Richard Dick Winters just had this calm, steady stare, the kind that made people straighten up without realizing why. And that calm is what let 12 exhausted paratroopers capture 50 Germans in one morning. Winters was a Pennsylvania farm kid who joined the U.S. Army in 1941 because he figured the country would need ordinary men who could keep their heads. He ended up commanding Easy Company of the 506th Parachute Infantry Regiment, the same unit that would later become famous as the Band of Brothers. On D-Day, June 6, 1944, Winters jumped out of a C-47 into total chaos. Paratroopers were scattered across miles of French countryside, half their equipment lost, radios gone, commanders missing. Most people would have panicked. Winters just checked his compass, rounded up whoever he could find, and went to work. Before dawn, he and a dozen men stumbled upon a fortified German artillery battery near the village of Bricourt Manor. 4 105mm guns were firing directly on the beaches where American troops were landing, every shell killing men by the dozen. No one had orders to attack it. Winters looked at the guns, looked at his 12 guys, and said something like, "All right, let's take care of it." He broke the assault into small teams, had one squad lay down covering fire while others flanked through trenches, and personally led the charge. He moved like a chess player who happened to be holding a rifle, precise, ruthless, never shouting. They hit the first gun, tossed grenades, disabled it, then the second, then the third. By the time they reached the fourth, the Germans were in full retreat. In 15 minutes, 12 paratroopers had destroyed an entire artillery position defended by about 50 enemy soldiers, captured the map showing every gun battery along Utah Beach, and saved hundreds of lives. When Winters turned in the intel, the higher-ups were stunned, not just at the result, but at how surgical it was. It later became the textbook example of small unit tactics still taught at military academies today. Winters went on to lead Easy Company through Holland, Bastogne, and into Germany itself. He never asked his men to do something he wouldn't do first. When food ran out, he starved with them. When shells hit, he was the one checking the line. They followed him because he never raised his voice. He just made you believe you could do the impossible. After the war, he turned down fame and promotions. When Band of Brothers made him a household name decades later, he said, "I'm not a hero, but I served in a company of heroes." That was Dick Winters, the man who turned calm into a weapon, leadership into an art, and 12 soldiers into a force strong enough to silence a German battery and echo through history. He didn't fight for glory. He fought to make sure the men beside him made it home. The battlefield is loud. Screaming engines, explosions, chaos everywhere. Now imagine all of that, and you're the only one left alive. For most people, that's the end of the story. For Fritz Kristen, that's where the story starts. Kristen was just 19, a kid from Bavaria who joined the German army in 1941 as an anti-tank gunner on the Eastern Front. He wasn't an officer, wasn't a commander, just one guy in a small crew manning a 50mm anti-tank cannon. It was a simple job: load, aim, fire, repeat. Until one morning, near the village of Krasnaya Polyana, his quiet stretch of frozen forest turned into hell. The Soviets launched a massive counterattack. Tanks rolled over the snow like a steel avalanche, flanked by waves of infantry. Kristen's battery opened fire. Boom, reload, boom, reload, until Soviet shells started landing around them. One by one, his crew went down. Within minutes, every man was dead or dying. Smoke everywhere, machine gun fire rattling the air. And Fritz Kristen was alone. He could have run, no one would have blamed him, but instead he decided to keep firing, by himself, against a tank column. He loaded shells alone, 50-pound slabs of steel, heaved them into the breach, fired, and then did it again and again and again. Every shot kicked the gun backward, nearly knocking him over. The air stank of cordite and burning fuel. He was deafened, shaking, half blinded by smoke, but he didn't stop. When Soviet infantry tried to rush him, he swung the gun around, used high explosive rounds, and tore them apart. When tanks crept closer, he adjusted his aim for the weak spots and hit them right through the armor. One tank exploded, then another, then another. By nightfall, the snow around him was littered with wrecks. 13 Soviet tanks destroyed, along with countless infantry. For 2 days, he held that position completely alone, surviving on melted snow and adrenaline until reinforcements finally reached him. When German troops arrived, they found Kristen standing next to his cannon, soot-covered, surrounded by twisted metal. He hadn't slept. He hadn't eaten. His hands were burned raw from handling hot shell casings. They thought he was a ghost. He'd turned a single gun into an entire battery. For his insane stand, Fritz Kristen was awarded the Iron Cross and later the Knight Cross, one of Nazi Germany's highest honors. Even his officers called his actions beyond comprehension. He'd basically fought an armored battalion to a draw. Alone. After the war, Kristen disappeared quietly into civilian life. He rarely spoke about what happened, maybe because there's no normal way to explain something like that. What makes his story so wild isn't the medal count or even the number of tanks. It's that when everything collapsed, when the crew died, the odds broke, and the world said, "That's it," he just refused to pull the trigger. Fritz Kristen didn't survive the battle because of training or rank. He survived because he simply didn't know when to quit. They called her the White Mouse because the Nazis could never catch her. And that nickname, it drove them insane. They even put a 5 million franc bounty on her head. But Nancy Wake wasn't hiding in fear. She was out there killing Nazis, blowing up trains and leading 7,000 resistance fighters like a war-era action heroine who just happened to enjoy a good glass of wine. Nancy was born in New Zealand, raised in Australia, and ended up in France as a journalist before the war. She had charm, looks, and an attitude that could melt steel. When Germany invaded, she watched Nazi soldiers march through Paris and thought, absolutely not, so she joined the French resistance. At first, she was a courier, carrying secret messages, hiding fugitives, and smuggling people across the Pyrenees into Spain. The Gestapo hated her. Every time they thought they were close, she slipped away. She changed hair color, forged passports, and talked her way past checkpoints with a smile so convincing it could have disarmed attack. Eventually, she joined the Special Operations Executive, Britain's spy network. They parachuted her into occupied France ahead of D-Day, where she organized sabotage operations in the Auvergne Mountains. By then, she was fluent in deception and explosives. Locals followed her not because she barked orders, because she was fearless. She coordinated ambushes, destroyed bridges, and cut German supply lines for months. But she wasn't just a commander, she was in the thick of it. When her unit's wireless operator was captured, she biked over 300 miles through enemy territory to deliver crucial codes. No sleep, no backup, just caffeine and rage. When a Nazi guard tried to block her during a raid, she took his rifle, broke his nose, and snapped his neck with her bare hands. Later, she said, "He was about to give us away. There was no time for subtlety." By the summer of 1944, she had turned a ragtag band of maquisards into a coordinated guerrilla army, 7,000 fighters strong. They destroyed supply convoys, ambushed reinforcements, and tied down whole German divisions that were supposed to defend Normandy. She directed battles with bullets flying past her head, dressed in slacks, boots, and attitude. And through it all, she never lost her sense of humor. Her men called her Madame Fiery because she swore like a sailor and smoked like one too. When they ran out of grenades, she'd grin and say, "Then throw the wine bottles, they'll still duck." When the war ended, Nancy received every medal the Allies could throw at her, including the George Medal from Britain, the Medal of Freedom from the U.S., and the Legion of Honor from France. But when people asked if she ever felt afraid, she just said, "I hate war, but I hate bastards who start wars even more." Nancy Wake wasn't built for legend. She built it herself. A spy, a fighter, and a woman who turned an occupied nation into her personal battlefield and somehow made defiance look glamorous. Most spies tried to blend in. Tommy McPherson tried the opposite. He waltzed into occupied France wearing full British uniform, carrying a pistol, a dagger, and an ego the size of Scotland, and somehow convinced the Nazis he commanded an entire army. Born in 1920 in Edinburgh, McPherson was a natural overachiever. Captain of every sports team, quick on his feet, and annoyingly confident. When World War II began, he joined the British Army and quickly became known for two things: bravery and a refusal to do anything the normal way. So, of course, he was perfect for the Special Operations Executive, the branch that specialized in sabotage, deception, and chaos. In 1943, he was sent to France ahead of D-Day to help local resistance groups slow down German forces. Most agents went undercover, dressed as civilians. McPherson, however, decided that was boring.
He landed in France wearing his full Highland uniform, kilt, sporran, insignia, the works. If he was going to get caught, he figured he might as well look fantastic. At first, the French resistance thought he was suicidal. Then they saw him work. He started blowing up railway lines, ambushing convoys, and leaving fake reports to make the Germans think a massive Allied army was moving through the area. He even had a few jeeps decorated with phony division markings to make it look like an invasion force. One of his favorite tricks was psychological warfare. He'd drive up to German outposts, act completely confident, and issue fake orders from headquarters. The Germans, seeing a decorated officer with perfect manners and a bold Scottish accent, usually obeyed. They thought no one that calm could possibly be lying. The most legendary moment came when he faced down the commander of a German garrison in Montauban. Instead of storming the place, McPherson strolled in with a few resistance fighters and told the colonel his troops were surrounded by thousands of Allied soldiers, which was total nonsense. But he looked so certain, so official, that the colonel surrendered 1,500 men and dozens of vehicles on the spot. No gunfire, no blood, just pure confidence and a well-ironed kilt. He later said, "If you act like you own the place, half the time people believe you do." That's either a life philosophy or a very polite form of psychological warfare. McPherson spent the rest of the war sabotaging German supply lines, blowing bridges, and bluffing officers into giving up. By the end, the Gestapo had labeled him the most dangerous man in France. He collected multiple decorations, including 3 military crosses, and somehow survived the whole ordeal without ever changing his uniform. After the war, he went home, ran a successful business, and even became a ceremonial knight, because apparently the only thing more dangerous than his explosives was his charm. Tommy McPherson didn't just fight the enemy. He outperformed them theatrically. He proved that sometimes the deadliest weapon on the battlefield isn't firepower, it's confidence. The bravest soldier on a battlefield doesn't always carry a gun. Sometimes he carries a medical bag and walks straight into gunfire to save everyone else. That was Captain Noel Godfrey Chavas, a man who earned 2 Victoria Crosses, not for killing enemies, but for refusing to let his own men die. Noel wasn't a loud, battle-hungry type. He was quiet, kind, and methodical, more professor than warrior. Before the war, he was a doctor and an Olympic athlete, representing Britain in the 1908 Games. When World War I broke out, he joined the Royal Army Medical Corps. His job, treat the wounded, not fight. But for Chavas, that meant going wherever the wounded were, even if that meant crawling across no man's land under machine gun fire. He served with the Liverpool Scottish Regiment on the Western Front, one of the worst places on earth between 1915 and 1917. Shells fell every few seconds, trenches flooded with mud, gas drifted through the air, and dead men lay between the lines for days. For most medics, the order was simple: wait until night to recover casualties. Chavas ignored that rule almost every day. He'd crawl out in broad daylight, bullets snapping inches from his head, dragging wounded soldiers back by their collars. Sometimes he'd get shot himself, patch the wound, and go out again. In 1916, at Guillemont, during the Battle of the Somme, he rescued dozens of men under constant shelling, all while being wounded twice. He treated soldiers in bomb craters, bandaging them with trembling hands, using his own jacket as a pillow for dying men. That earned him his first Victoria Cross. A year later, he was still out there, this time near the town of Passchendaele, in what became one of the bloodiest battles of the entire war. The rain never stopped. The ground had turned into black sludge that swallowed boots and bodies alike. Chavas set up a dressing station in a ruined dugout, and for 2 days straight he worked non-stop. No food, no rest, just wounded soldier after wounded soldier. A shell hit the post. He was thrown across the floor, skull fractured, shrapnel tearing into his side. Anyone else would have stayed down. Chavas got up, patched himself, and went back to work. He was eventually found dying, still giving orders to his stretcher-bearers, still whispering encouragement to the men. His last words were a request: "Take care of my boys." He died 2 days later, only 32 years old. The War Office awarded him a second Victoria Cross, one of only 3 people in history to ever receive 2. But medals never defined him. His legacy wasn't in what he destroyed, but in what he refused to let be destroyed: human life. Noel Chavas didn't fight for glory or victory. He fought against death itself, and for a little while he kept winning.
When the Nazis captured Violette Cibot, they expected tears. Instead, they got a black-eyed French-British spy who spat in their faces and kept fighting long after her body couldn't. Violette wasn't born a soldier. She was born in Paris, raised in London, loved fashion, dancing, and good coffee. By 19, she was married to a dashing French officer, Etienne Zibot, who went off to fight in North Africa. Not long after, she received the telegram every soldier's wife feared. Her husband had been killed in action. She was 22, widowed, and furious. So when Britain's Special Operations Executive, SOE, the shadowy branch that trained spies, saboteurs, and assassins, started recruiting women to work behind enemy lines, Violette didn't hesitate. Her friends thought she was too pretty, too gentle, too young. The SOE found out she was also too good to ignore. She trained in unarmed combat, weapons handling, and parachuting. Instructors said she was one of the best shots we ever had. She could charm her way past a German checkpoint, then blow it up 5 minutes later. In 1944, she parachuted into occupied France with orders to help coordinate the resistance before D-Day. Her code name, Corinne. Her mission, disrupt communications, gather intel, and make Nazi life miserable. For a while, she did just that, sabotaging rail lines, organizing supply drops, and outsmarting Gestapo patrols with nerves of steel. But during her second mission, things went wrong. Her car was ambushed at a roadblock outside Limoges. Instead of surrendering, she leapt out, grabbed a Sten gun, and held off an entire German patrol alone while her driver escaped. When her weapon jammed, she tried to fix it mid-fight, taking return fire from 3 sides. They finally captured her, battered, bleeding, and out of ammo. But capture didn't mean defeat. At Gestapo headquarters, they tried interrogation, then torture, then starvation, and she gave them nothing. Not a single name, not a single secret. According to survivors from the Ravensbrück concentration camp, even half-starved and beaten, she still carried herself like a soldier, defiant, unbroken. One woman remembered her whispering, "We'll see who wins this war." In early 1945, with Germany collapsing, Violette was executed by firing squad. She was 23. When Allied troops liberated the camp weeks later, they found her name carved into cell walls, a final reminder that even in the darkest places, resistance never completely dies. After the war, Britain posthumously awarded her the George Cross, the highest civilian decoration for bravery. France awarded her the Croix de Guerre and the Médaille de Résistance. But medals can't capture what made her extraordinary. She wasn't a hardened killer. She was a mother, a widow, a woman who refused to bow down to the worst men in the world. And when the Gestapo tried to break her, she didn't scream, didn't beg. She simply stared them down and said through broken teeth that they'd never win. Violette Cibot didn't survive the war, but she absolutely defeated it. Every night, German trains rolled through occupied Poland, full of soldiers, ammunition, and arrogance. And every morning, those same trains mysteriously exploded, derailed, or vanished into fire. The reason? A calm, bespectacled man named Józef Radosław Rybecki, who turned railway sabotage into a national sport. Rybecki didn't look like a resistance legend. He was a teacher, a father, a man who used to spend more time grading papers than blowing up tracks. But when the Nazis invaded Poland in 1939, they dismantled everything he loved: his school, his city, and his country's freedom. So Rybecki decided if Poland had to go underground, he'd build the tunnels himself. He joined the Armia Krajowa, the Polish Home Army, and became one of its key commanders. His code name? Radosław, meaning happy glory, was ironically fitting for a man whose job involved smuggling weapons and ordering nighttime demolition runs under constant threat of execution. His specialty? Trains. The Germans relied on railways for everything: troop movements, supplies, prisoners. So Rybecki made those tracks his personal playground. His teams worked in darkness, crawling along frozen steel with pliers and wrenches, planting bombs by moonlight and vanishing before sunrise. Sometimes they'd loosen bolts so trains would derail quietly miles later. Other times they'd hit bridges, timing the blasts so explosions lit up the sky like grim fireworks. He coordinated hundreds of these missions, sometimes several in one night, crippling the Nazi supply chain. Entire divisions missed battles because of his handiwork. German officers started referring to certain routes as the cursed lines. They increased guards, set up ambushes, even executed civilians in retaliation. But Rybecki's network always came back. His operations weren't just about destruction, they were about message. Each wrecked train said, "You may occupy our land, but you'll never control it." He made sure resistance fighters were trained, armed, and invisible. And even when betrayal hit, when Gestapo raids rounded up dozens of his men, he never stopped reorganizing. Like cutting the head off a hydra, the Germans couldn't kill what kept growing back. By 1944, he was one of the main coordinators of the Warsaw Uprising, commanding units under the Radosław Group.
He led from the front, not from the desk, running through burning streets, ferrying wounded fighters, and personally carrying supplies when trucks couldn't. For 2 months his men held the city against tanks, planes, and overwhelming odds. When Warsaw finally fell, he went into hiding again, still refusing to surrender. After the war, he was arrested, this time by the new communist regime, who saw resistance heroes as political threats. He was tortured and imprisoned, but survived. He lived long enough to see Poland regain its independence decades later, quietly honored as one of the architects of its unbreakable spirit. Józef Rebecki never became famous outside Poland, but his legacy runs like those railways he once destroyed, stretching across the nation's memory, connecting courage to freedom. He didn't just fight an army, he fought gravity, fear, and time, every night, one train at a time.
When you think about a bad day, remember Jan Balsrud. Shot at, blown up, hunted by the Gestapo, half frozen, half blind, and still somehow alive, hiding under snowdrifts in the Arctic with a knife and 10 toes he wouldn't keep for long. Balsrud was part of a small Norwegian commando team in 1943. Their mission, under British command, was to sabotage Nazi air bases along the coast of occupied Norway. Everything went wrong immediately. Their boat, loaded with explosives, ran aground near a tiny village after a navigation mistake. Then, as if the universe wasn't done laughing, a German patrol spotted them. Within minutes, the mission collapsed into gunfire and chaos. 11 of the team were captured and executed. Jan Balsrud was the 12th man and the only one who got away. He dove into the freezing Arctic water, swimming through ice chunks with bullets snapping around him. He managed to reach the shore barefoot, frostbitten, and carrying only a pistol. Behind him, the Germans were already spreading out, hunting. The entire coastline became a manhunt. For the next 9 weeks, Balsrud moved through snow, rocks, and blizzards, dragging his mangled legs toward the Swedish border. Villagers along the way risked their lives to feed and hide him, sometimes stuffing him into cellars or under floorboards while Nazis searched houses above. At one point, he was buried in an avalanche. Another time, he fell into an icy river and nearly drowned. When frostbite set in, his toes blackened and swelled until he could barely move. Infection followed. No doctors, no medicine, no options. So, he did the unthinkable. He took out his knife and cut off his own toes, one by one, without anesthesia, without flinching. Because if he didn't, gangrene would have killed him. He wrapped the stumps in cloth, lay back in the snow cave he dug, and waited for the pain to fade enough to start crawling again. Eventually, locals found him delirious and half dead. They hid him inside a barn, then a mountainside hut, feeding him through a tiny hole in the wall to avoid discovery. For weeks he lay there as Gestapo patrols combed the hills. Finally, when the weather cleared, a group of Norwegian patriots put him on a sled and pulled him across 30 miles of snow under cover of darkness to the Swedish border.
he crossed into neutral Sweden, weighing less than 80 pounds, missing several toes, and carrying scars that would last a lifetime. But he made it. After recovering, Balsrud went back to England, not to rest, but to train new commandos. Because apparently cutting off your own toes isn't enough to earn a vacation. He lived to old age, never calling himself a hero. When asked how he'd survived, he said simply, "Because I had to." Jan Balsrud's story isn't about strength. It's about stubbornness, the kind that refuses to die, even when the body's falling apart. He didn't beat the Nazis with bullets. He beat them with willpower.
Most prisoners begged to escape Auschwitz. Witold Pilecki begged to get in. In 1940, Nazi Germany's new camp in southern Poland was still a rumor. No one outside knew what really happened behind the fences. Pilecki, a Polish resistance officer, decided the world needed proof. So he did something that sounds like madness. He let himself be captured and sent there on purpose. He forged a fake identity, joined a roundup on the streets of Warsaw, and was hauled away in a cattle car packed with terrified men. When the gates closed behind him and he saw the sign Arbeit macht frei, he finally understood what he'd done and didn't flinch. Inside Auschwitz, survival was a coin toss. Disease, starvation, and random executions were routine. Pilecki pretended to be an ordinary inmate, shoveling gravel by day, planning rebellion by night. He started secretly organizing the prisoners, priests, doctors, teachers, anyone still alive enough to fight, into an underground resistance he called Związek Organizacji Wojskowej, Military Organization Union. They built radios from stolen parts, forged escape papers, and smuggled messages to the outside world hidden inside laundry bundles. His reports, written in tiny code and delivered through couriers who risked their lives, were the first eyewitness accounts of mass gassing, starvation, and industrial murder. He described trains arriving every day, the showers that weren't showers, and ashes raining from chimneys. London and Washington received his warnings and filed them away as unconfirmed. The truth was so horrific they didn't believe it. Pilecki stayed for 2.5 years, longer than any human should survive in that place. He caught typhus, starved to skin and bone, watched friends be executed, and still kept writing. When his network was finally discovered and the Gestapo closed in, he decided it was time to leave. One night in April 1943, he and 2 others overpowered a guard, cut the fence, and ran. They stole a horse and wagon, hid in barns, and traveled over 100 miles to safety. Then he did the unthinkable again. He went straight back to fighting. He wrote a detailed report for the Polish underground and kept resisting until the war ended. You'd think a man who survived Auschwitz and helped expose its horrors would be treated as a hero. But when the Soviets took over Poland, heroes like him became inconvenient. He was arrested by the communist secret police, tortured for months, and executed in 1948 for spying for the West. His body was dumped in an unmarked grave that remained lost for decades. When his story finally surfaced after the Cold War, the world realized what he'd done, walked willingly into the worst place on earth to tell the truth.
Historians call him the volunteer for Auschwitz. His country calls him a symbol of moral courage. Witold Pilecki didn't fight for glory or revenge. He fought for the truth and paid the highest price for it. He once wrote from his cell, "I tried to live so that in the hour of my death I would be happy rather than afraid." After everything he endured, you get the feeling he meant it.
When the Nazis rolled into Russia in 1941, they expected an easy victory. They didn't expect to be haunted by an 18-year-old girl with fire in her hands and defiance in her eyes. Her name was Zoya Kosmodyamskaya, and she became one of the first female heroes of the Soviet Union, though she didn't live long enough to see it. Zoya was a schoolgirl from a small town near Moscow. She loved literature, played the violin, and wrote essays about courage. When Germany invaded the Soviet Union, she volunteered almost immediately. The Red Army didn't send her to the front with a rifle. They sent her into the forests with gasoline and a lighter. She was recruited into a partisan unit behind enemy lines, a secret team tasked with sabotage, cutting communications, spreading confusion, and setting fire to anything the German army needed. Her first missions were textbook: burned bridges, destroyed supply wagons, vanished into the woods. But in November 1941, she was assigned something far riskier: infiltrate a small village occupied by German troops and destroy their winter supply depots before they reached Moscow. Snow fell thick that night. Zoya crept into the village alone, doused a stable full of Nazi equipment in kerosene, and lit the match. The fire tore through the building like vengeance made visible. She vanished into the forest before the soldiers could react. The next night, she went back for more. That's when they caught her. Villagers saw her dragged through the streets, her face swollen from beatings, her hands tied behind her back. The Germans demanded names, orders, anything. She said nothing. They tortured her, stripped her, and paraded her barefoot in the freezing cold to scare others into silence. Instead, she became louder. At her public execution, she was forced to stand beneath a gallows in the village square, surrounded by townspeople who were too terrified to meet her eyes. The Germans expected her to beg. She smiled instead. Before they tightened the rope, she shouted, "You can't hang all 190 million of us. The people will avenge me." Even her captors hesitated. The officer in charge reportedly looked shaken before giving the order. When it was over, the villagers buried her secretly that night, and the legend began. Soviet troops later found her body when they liberated the area. Her story spread like wildfire. Moscow newspapers printed her final words, turning her into a symbol of youthful defiance. Streets were renamed after her. Her portrait hung in classrooms. She became the face of resistance, not because of propaganda, but because she was real. Zoya Kosmodyamskaya didn't fight with bombs or bullets. She fought with conviction. She knew she'd die, but she refused to let her fear outlive her courage. And that's why her last act wasn't just defiance, it was prophecy. The people did avenge her, and long after the war ended, her flame never really went out. Warsaw, 1942. The Nazis have walled in nearly 500,000 Jews behind brick and barbed wire. Starvation, disease, and deportation are daily life inside the Warsaw ghetto. And in the middle of that nightmare, walked a 30-something social worker named Irena Sendler, carrying hope in her handbag and courage no one could measure. By day, Irena looked ordinary: tidy coat, calm smile, papers stamped with an official seal. The Germans thought she was a Polish public health worker inspecting for typhus. What she was really doing was mapping escape routes for Jewish children, one at a time, sometimes 10 at a time, right under the occupiers' noses. She worked for a secret network inside the Polish underground called Jagota, the Council to Aid Jews. Her pass let her enter the ghetto legally, supposedly to check sanitation. Each visit she smuggled something out, sometimes a baby in a toolbox, sometimes a teenager hidden under garbage in a truck. Infants went out in potato sacks or coffin boxes. Older kids walked out disguised as coughing patients or Catholic apprentices. Every child she saved needed a new name, new papers, a new life. She recorded each one carefully on scraps of tissue paper: Jewish name, false Polish identity, and the family that would shelter them. Then she sealed the lists in glass jars and buried them beneath an apple tree in a neighbor's yard, so that when the war ended, she could dig them up and reunite children with whoever was left of their real families. It was a system built on silence and faith. One wrong word, one curious guard, and hundreds would die. Still, she kept going, night after night, street after street. By 1943, she'd helped 2,500 children escape deportation and almost certain death. Then the Gestapo caught her. They broke into her apartment, found forged documents, and dragged her to Paviak prison for interrogation. They broke her legs, her feet, her ribs. She never gave up a single name, not one. When the Nazis prepared to execute her, the Polish underground bribed a guard to look the other way, and she slipped into the city's back alleys, on crutches, wounded and still unbroken. She spent the rest of the war in hiding, continuing her work under new aliases. When the fighting finally stopped, she dug up those glass jars. Most of the children's parents were gone, murdered in Treblinka. But thanks to her, the children lived. Decades later, someone asked how she found the strength. She said, "I was brought up to believe that when you see a drowning person, you must jump in and try to save them, whether you can swim or not." Irena Sendler never carried a weapon, never fired a shot, yet she fought the Holocaust with paperwork, patience, and pure defiance. She didn't just rescue children. She rescued the idea that even in the darkest time imaginable, one human being could still choose to be kind. The French resistance was full of brave souls, but few burned brighter or vanished faster than Andrée Borel. She was nicknamed Denise, though the Germans knew her better by another name whispered in panic: the Little Terror. Before the war, she'd been a nurse and a hotel worker in Paris, ordinary, quiet, the kind of person no one would ever suspect could dismantle an empire. But when the Nazis marched in, Andrée didn't waste time being shocked. She slipped underground, joined the resistance, and started smuggling Allied pilots across the Pyrenees. She wasn't a spy yet, just a young woman with grit and a sense of outrage. Her talent for cool-headed defiance got her noticed by Britain's Special Operations Executive, the same shadow network that trained saboteurs like Violet Sabot and Nancy Wake. They parachuted her into occupied France in 1942, making her one of the very first female agents to jump behind enemy lines. The operation's name was Prosper. Its mission: build resistance cells, organize sabotage, and make Hitler's occupation bleed from the inside. Andrée hit the ground running, literally. She moved between Paris and the countryside, setting up safe houses, delivering weapons, and coordinating supply drops. She was the kind of agent every handler dreamed of: resourceful, invisible, unflappable. Her specialty became power stations. She knew exactly when to strike, blowing transformers and fuel depots with surgical precision. Entire regions went dark overnight, factories shut down, trains stalled, and German officers lost their minds trying to find the phantom woman behind it all. The Gestapo eventually traced the Prosper network through a web of betrayals and bad luck. In June 1943, they surrounded her safe house. Andrée fought, gun in one hand, grenade in the other, but they captured her alive. She was taken to Fresnes prison, tortured for weeks, and interrogated by men who thought they could break anyone. They never broke her. When asked to give up names, she spat at her captors. When they beat her, she laughed. One fellow prisoner said Andrée's eyes burned like blue fire, as if daring the Nazis to do their worst. After months of imprisonment, the Gestapo quietly shipped her to Notzweiler Struthof concentration camp. There was no trial, no hearing, no sentence, just an order. On July 6, 1944, she and 3 other SOE agents were told they were being moved. Instead, they were led into a room disguised as a medical chamber. The guards injected them with phenol and shoved their bodies into the crematorium. She was 24 years old. When the war ended, survivors told the Allies what had happened. The British government posthumously awarded her the George Cross. France gave her the Croix de Guerre and the Médaille de la Résistance. Andrée Borel's war wasn't long, but it was incandescent. She left the trail of blacked-out cities, wrecked cables, and shaken occupiers in her wake. She didn't get a last speech or a dramatic rescue, just the satisfaction of knowing that before the darkness swallowed her, she'd turned the lights off on the enemy first. You know you've made history when you win medals from both sides of a world war. Juan Pujol Garcia did exactly that, one from the Nazis for loyalty, and one from the British for lying to them. He was the man who convinced Hitler that D-Day was a decoy. Born in Barcelona, Juan Pujol wasn't a soldier or a spy. He was just a man who hated fascists, hated Nazis, and hated being told what to do. When World War II broke out, he decided he wanted to help Britain. The problem was, Britain didn't want him. He tried to volunteer as a spy 3 times and was rejected every time. So he did what every great con artist does. He went freelance. He faked his new identity as a pro-German businessman, walked into the nearest Nazi office in Madrid, and told them he wanted to spy for the Reich. They loved him immediately. They gave him invisible ink, fake documents, and an assignment to recruit agents in Britain. The only problem, he had never been to Britain. Instead, he went to Lisbon, bought a stack of English guidebooks, and started inventing an entire spy network from scratch.
He wrote his reports using information pooled from newspapers and travel maps, sprinkled in believable nonsense, and mailed them to his German handlers. They were so impressed that Berlin started sending him cash to pay his imaginary agents. By 1942, he had 26 fictional operatives, sailors, civil servants, soldiers, all living in his imagination, and the Nazis believed every word. Eventually, British intelligence, MI5, caught wind of him and thought, okay, this guy is either insane or brilliant. They chose brilliant. They brought him to London, gave him the code name Garbo, because he was such a good actor, and turned him into one of the most valuable double agents of the war. Together with his handler, he built an even more elaborate web of lies. He convinced the Germans that he had dozens of informants across the UK sending him coded messages, all of which he decoded himself. He'd even send fake letters warning about imaginary Allied missions, so that when nothing happened, the Germans thought the Allies were just unpredictable geniuses. Then came D-Day, the Allied invasion of Normandy. Hitler knew an invasion was coming, but didn't know where. Garbo sent a carefully timed series of reports confirming that the real attack would be at Calais, not Normandy. The deception worked perfectly. Hitler held back his armored divisions, waiting for an invasion that never came. By the time he realized the truth, Normandy was already lost. Historians agree that Garbo's fake reports saved tens of thousands of Allied lives. After the war, the Nazis never found out he'd betrayed them. In fact, they awarded him the Iron Cross. The British gave him the MBE, Member of the British Empire. Only one man in history ever fooled both sides of World War II and got thanked for it. Juan Pujol Garcia didn't fire a bullet, but he helped win the biggest battle of the century, armed with nothing but imagination, a typewriter, and the world's most convincing poker face.
Before James Bond ever existed, there was Christina Skarbek, a Polish countess with a smile that disarmed men and a stiletto hidden in her garter. She fought Nazis with charm, knives, and cyanide pills, and she was so good at it that Ian Fleming later used her as the inspiration for Bond's lover, Vesper Lind. Born into Polish nobility in 1908, Christina had a taste for speed, danger, and rebellion long before war made it fashionable. She loved fast cars, mountain climbing, and making powerful men nervous. When Germany invaded Poland in 1939, she was stranded in Africa with her British lover. Most people would have waited the war out somewhere safe. Christina marched straight into British intelligence headquarters and said, "I'd like to spy, please." They took one look at her, elegant, multilingual, and absolutely fearless, and signed her on the spot for the Special Operations Executive, the same secret agency that would later recruit Violette Sabo and Nancy Wake. Her first mission: sneak into Nazi-occupied Poland across the frozen Tatra Mountains to gather intel. She hiked for 3 days in sub-zero blizzards, dodging patrols and frostbite, and came back with the first concrete proof that Germany was preparing to invade the Soviet Union. That alone should have made her a legend, but Christina was just getting started. In France, she joined resistance cells, smuggled microfilm inside her gloves, and organized sabotage raids. When her network was busted and the Gestapo arrested her, she didn't panic, she performed. While being interrogated, she bit her tongue until it bled, then coughed blood onto the table, pretending to have tuberculosis. The terrified Gestapo officer immediately released her, afraid of infection. She walked out of prison smiling, borrowed lipstick, and sent a note to British HQ, back at work. Her allies swore she had a cat's luck and a fox's brain. She carried a small pistol, a cyanide capsule, and nerves of steel. She was known to talk her way past checkpoints by pretending to be a bored French aristocrat, fluttering her eyelashes while hiding explosives under her coat. By 1944, she was running operations that armed entire French resistance groups before D-Day. One of her most famous stunts was negotiating the release of several Allied agents. She simply marched into the Gestapo office and told the commandant that the war was over, Germany had surrendered, and he'd better cooperate if he wanted leniency. He believed her, and she walked out with the prisoners. After the war, Christina's luck faded. The spy networks dissolved, and peace was no place for women like her. She drifted through Europe under different names, working odd jobs, still too sharp, too restless, too alive for a quiet life. In 1952, she was murdered in a London hotel, stabbed to death by a jealous ex-lover. Her funeral was small, but the British intelligence community made sure she was buried with honors. Christina Skarbek wasn't just a spy. She was a storm in heels, a woman who treated espionage like art and death like an inconvenience. She didn't inspire just a Bond girl. She was the Bond girl, only deadlier. In the world of World War II, espionage, betrayal was everywhere. But no one expected it to come from inside the Gestapo. Meet Hans Kiefer, a man whose job was to crush spies, until one day he quietly became one himself. Kiefer was the commandant of the Gestapo prison at 84 Avenue Foch in Paris, a name that still gives historians chills. That address was the Nazi nerve center for interrogating captured Allied agents. British, French, Polish, even American operatives passed through those doors. Many never came out. To the outside world, Kiefer was the ultimate villain, a clean-cut officer in a black leather coat, fluent in English, polite, efficient, and merciless, the perfect bureaucrat of fear. But beneath that image was a man who'd begun to hate the machine he worked for. Kiefer wasn't a monster by nature. Before the war, he'd been a linguist and a civil servant. When Hitler's government absorbed the police, he found himself swept into the Gestapo, whether he liked it or not. At first he did his job, interrogating captured agents from Britain's Special Operations Executive. He even handled the famous network run by Violet Sabo, André Borel, and Noor Inayat Khan. But the more he saw, the less he believed. The brutality disgusted him. The executions sickened him. And quietly, he decided that if he couldn't stop the Gestapo, he could sabotage it. Using his authority, Kiefer began leaking small bits of information to the French resistance, names of prisoners about to be moved,
lists of agents still alive, sometimes even advance warnings of raids. He couldn't do it openly. One slip meant torture and a bullet. But he found ways to signal through sympathetic intermediaries inside Paris. Some reports even reached British intelligence through underground radio operators who had no idea their source was a Gestapo colonel. His cooperation saved dozens of captured agents. He purposely delayed executions, faked transfer papers, and made interrogation notes vanish. Once, when an SOE courier was arrested, Kiefer stalled the process just long enough for her network to scatter before the Gestapo could round them up. The Germans saw him as slow and bureaucratic. The Allies started referring to a mysterious source inside the Avenue Foch. By 1944, the war was turning. The Allies stormed Normandy. Paris rose up, and Kiefer's cover began to crumble. He stayed at his post until the liberation of the city, quietly ensuring as many prisoners as possible survived before retreating with German forces. When the war ended, he didn't flee to South America or hide behind excuses. He surrendered to the Allies and admitted what he had done. He was interrogated like the very people he'd once questioned, but when survivors confirmed his secret assistance, even former SOE agents testified in his defense. He still carried guilt for the lives he couldn't save, but the record showed one truth. The man who commanded the Gestapo prison in Paris had, in the shadows, fought against it. Hans Kiefer wasn't a hero in the Hollywood sense. No gunfights, no dramatic last stand. He was a man buried inside evil, who chose, quietly, to leak light through the cracks. And in the dark machinery of the Third Reich, even a single crack was enough to start its collapse.
Most soldiers dream of coming home alive. Leo Major dreamed of doing something so outrageous that his superiors would think he was lying. He succeeded by single-handedly liberating an entire Dutch city. Leo was a French-Canadian kid from Montreal who joined the army in 1940 because he wanted adventure. He got it in the worst possible way. By D-Day, he was a scout and sniper with the Régiment de la Chaudière, landing on Juno Beach under heavy fire. He was hit by shrapnel and lost an eye, but when medics tried to evacuate him, he refused. "You only need one eye to shoot Germans," he joked, and went right back to the front. A few months later, in the Scheldt campaign, he captured 93 German soldiers alone. He'd been separated from his unit, stumbled onto an enemy patrol, and somehow convinced them he had a whole company behind him. They surrendered. He marched them to HQ by himself, probably humming. But his real legend began in April 1945, when his unit reached the Dutch city of Zwolle. The place was full of German troops, over 1,000 of them, and the Canadians were preparing for a brutal bombardment that would flatten half the town. Leo hated that idea. Civilians had suffered enough. So he told his commander, "Give me one night. If I don't come back, you can start shelling." He slipped into the city after dark with one friend, Willie Arsenault. Not long after, Willie was killed in a firefight. Most people would have withdrawn. Leo got angry, and got creative. He began sprinting through the streets, alone, firing his submachine gun, tossing grenades, and shouting commands in both French and English to make it sound like a whole platoon was attacking. He ambushed patrols, blew up a staff car, and stormed the local Gestapo headquarters, killing or capturing whoever didn't run. Then he grabbed a captured officer and told him to spread the word. The Canadians are inside the city. Leave now or die. It worked. German soldiers started panicking, thinking a massive invasion had begun. By dawn, most of them had fled. When the Canadian Army finally moved in the next morning, they found the city quiet, and one exhausted, half-blind soldier waiting for them. Leo Major had liberated Zwolle by himself. He refused medals for it, saying his friends deserved them more. Then, as if to prove lightning could strike twice, he came back in 1951 during the Korean War and did it again. Leading a small Canadian unit, he captured a strategic hill from the Chinese army and held it for days under constant attack. He earned another Distinguished Conduct Medal, one of the only soldiers ever to win it twice in 2 different wars. Leo Major wasn't a movie hero. He was a prankster, a rebel, and possibly a little insane. But when cities fell and armies froze, he acted, and somehow everyone else caught up afterward. They called him the one-eyed ghost of Zwolle. But to the Dutch, he's still just the man who came out of the dark and gave them back their home. There are tough soldiers, and then there's Leo Gravel, a Canadian infantryman who made bullets look like mild inconveniences. He didn't survive the war because of luck. He survived because his body apparently never got the memo about dying. Gravel was part of the Royal 22nd Regiment, better known as the Vendus, one of Canada's most battle-hardened units in World War II. They fought through Italy, France, and the Netherlands, brutal, mud-choked campaigns where entire companies could vanish in a day. Leo was one of those men who didn't just fight through it, he charged straight into it. During one assault in Italy, his unit was pinned down by a German machine gun nest dug into a hillside. Every time someone moved, they got shredded. Orders were simple: hold position. Gravel looked at his sergeant and said something along the lines of, "I didn't walk all the way here to sit in the dirt." Then he stood up and started running. Halfway across the field, he took a bullet in the shoulder, then another in the leg. Most men would have dropped. Gravel didn't even slow down. He just switched hands on his rifle and kept going, bleeding, limping, and furious. He reached the nest, lobbed a grenade, and took out the entire crew in one deafening blast. Then instead of collapsing, he grabbed their machine gun and turned it around on the retreating Germans. When his squad finally caught up, they found him still firing, still bleeding, and somehow still cracking jokes. The medic who patched him up said he looked more annoyed than hurt. 2 weeks later, before he'd fully healed, he was back in the line. His luck, or stubbornness, didn't stop there. In another engagement in France, he was hit again, this time through the side. And again, he refused evacuation. "I'll rest when they do," he told the medics, pointing toward the German lines. He reloaded and joined the next attack, literally bandaged and limping. By the end of the campaign, he had enough scars to qualify as a road map and enough commendations to fill a wall.
What made Leo Gravel stand out wasn't just his durability, it was his humor. He stayed cheerful in the worst places imaginable. When asked later how he handled fear, he said, "I figured if I could still swear, I wasn't dead yet." That attitude turned him into a legend among his men. The unkillable guy who could shrug off a gunshot like a mosquito bite. After the war, Gravel went home quietly. He didn't brag or chase medals. He just went back working, drinking, and laughing like he always had, except now with a few extra holes as conversation starters. In every army, there's always that one soldier everyone watches because they just won't fall down. For the Canadian troops, that man was Leo Gravel, the one who took bullet after bullet, joke after joke, and still had the energy to charge the next machine gun nest.
There are brave soldiers, and then there's Yogendra Singh Yadav, a man who literally climbed into enemy gunfire, got shot 3 times, and still finished the mission with grenades in his hands. If you wrote it in a movie script, it would sound impossible, but it actually happened on a freezing Himalayan cliff, 17,000 feet above sea level during the Kargil War. It was 1999. Indian and Pakistani troops were locked in one of the most brutal mountain battles of modern times. The Pakistanis had captured key peaks along the line of control, sheer cliffs that looked impossible to scale. One of them was Tiger Hill, a rocky fortress bristling with machine guns. Whoever controlled it controlled the war. India sent in the 18 Grenadiers, an elite assault unit. Among them, a 19-year-old soldier named Yogendra Singh Yadav. His job? Lead the Ghatak platoon, the first wave, up a near vertical cliff at night, carrying 100 pounds of gear while the enemy rained bullets and mortars from above. They climbed using ropes and bare hands, boots scraping rock, each man knowing one slip meant a 2,000-foot drop. Halfway up, the enemy spotted them. Gunfire tore through the darkness. Within minutes, almost the entire platoon was dead or wounded. Yadav was hit 3 times, once in the leg, once in the arm, and once in the shoulder. He was barely conscious, bleeding out on the cliffside, but he refused to die there. He cut himself loose, hauled his body up the rest of the mountain, and crawled straight into the machine gun nest that had been slaughtering his men. He pulled the pin on a grenade and tossed it into the bunker. 1 explosion, 2. When the dust cleared, the enemy position was gone, along with the soldiers inside it. Still bleeding, Yadav picked up an assault rifle and attacked the next bunker, then the next. By the time reinforcements arrived, he had neutralized multiple enemy posts and cleared the path for the rest of his unit to storm the summit. The Indian flag was raised over Tiger Hill hours later. When the battle ended, the army reported that Yadav was dead. They even began processing his posthumous award until they found him, days later, still alive, barely breathing, buried under snow and rubble. He survived because, apparently, Yogendra Singh Yadav doesn't understand what fatal means. For his actions, he received India's highest military honor, the Paramveer Chakra, becoming its youngest living recipient. But medals never defined him. Years later, when asked how he managed to keep climbing after being shot 3 times, he said something almost absurdly simple. "My friends were up there. I had to reach them." There are soldiers who fight bravely. Then there are soldiers who fight gravity,
blood loss, and death itself, and still keep going. Yogendra Singh Yadav didn't just conquer Tiger Hill. He conquered the limit of what a human being can endure and showed the world what courage looks like at 17,000 feet. Most people's worst nightmare is falling out of a plane. For Nicholas Alcomede, that nightmare came true, and then it got weirder. He fell 18,000 feet from a burning bomber with no parachute, hit the ground, and walked away with nothing but a sore leg and a good story. Nicholas was a 21-year-old tail gunner in the Royal Air Force, flying on a night bombing run over Germany in March 1944. His job was brutal, sitting alone in a glass turret at the back of a Lancaster bomber, scanning the dark sky for enemy fighters. On that night, a German Ju-88 found them first. Cannon shells tore into the plane, hitting the fuel tanks. Within seconds, the aircraft was an inferno, flames roaring, hydraulics hissing, oxygen masks melting. The pilot shouted for everyone to bail out. Nicholas reached for his parachute, but it was already gone, burned to ashes by the fire behind him. The heat was so intense that his clothing started to melt. He had two choices, burn alive or jump. He jumped. At 18,000 feet. No parachute, just night, air, and gravity. He later said he had time to think, not panic, but think. He crossed his arms over his chest, turned to face the stars, and hoped it would be quick. Below him stretched endless darkness, until somehow he saw patches of white. Snow. Thick, deep, unbroken snow. And luck. So much impossible luck. Alcomede smashed through pine tree branches that slowed his fall, hit a soft drift of snow, and then silence. No broken bones, no crushed skull, just bruises, burns, and a twisted leg. He lay there, stunned, looking up at the night sky, realizing he was still alive. Then he did what any rational man would do. He lit a cigarette and laughed until he cried. When he tried to move, he discovered he'd landed in the middle of a forest, deep in enemy territory. Eventually, German soldiers found him and took him to a local hospital. They didn't believe his story at first until they went back to the crash site and found his burned parachute, still strapped to the wreckage. The Nazis were so impressed they gave him a certificate confirming the miracle. Even his interrogators seemed almost proud. He spent the rest of the war as a prisoner, but alive, which, statistically speaking, should have been impossible. After liberation, he went back to England and worked in a factory, living a quiet life that must have felt surreal after cheating physics to survive. When people later asked him how he felt about falling 3 miles from the sky, he said, "I've never been afraid of heights since." Nicholas Alcomede didn't just survive a fall. He survived the kind of odds you can't calculate. It wasn't a miracle in the religious sense. It was a miracle in the mathematical one. He proved that sometimes, when fate pushes you out of the plane, the world itself bends just enough to catch you. When the British Army retreated from Burma in 1942, most soldiers fled toward India. Hugh Seacrum did the opposite. He walked deeper into the jungle. Cut off from command, surrounded by Japanese troops, and completely alone, he decided to start his own private war. With a handful of tribal allies, a bolt-action rifle, and unshakable loyalty.
Seagram was a tall, soft-spoken officer with the kind of calm that made other men listen. The locals called him Grandfather Longlegs, partly because of his 6'4" frame, partly because he never treated them like tools of the empire. When the British collapsed under the Japanese invasion, the tribes of Burma, the Karens and Kachins, were left behind, forced to survive between two brutal armies. Seagram stayed with them. He refused evacuation, saying, "They trusted me. I can't leave them now." For the next 3 years, he vanished into the jungle. No reinforcements, no supplies, no radio contact. Just rain, leeches, and faith. He trained villagers as guerrilla fighters, teaching them to ambush Japanese patrols and cut supply lines. They struck fast, vanished into the trees, and made the jungle itself their ally. The Japanese were so infuriated, they put a bounty on the tall Englishman, dead or alive. But Seagram didn't lead like a typical officer. He lived exactly as his men did. Barefoot, rice for meals, sleeping under leaves. He treated the tribes not as subordinates, but as brothers. When one of them was punished, he shared the punishment. When rations ran out, he gave his share away. The Karens began to see him less as a foreigner and more as a guardian spirit. He wasn't just fighting a war, he was building loyalty that no army could break. By 1943, the Japanese realized the only way to stop the resistance was to burn entire villages. Hundreds were executed or starved because they had helped the tall Briton. Seagram couldn't bear it. He knew the only way to save his people was to give himself up. One night, he walked into a Japanese camp unarmed and surrendered, saying, "If my life can save theirs, it's worth the trade." The executions stopped. The villagers were spared. He was imprisoned, beaten, and interrogated for months. Even under torture, he refused to name a single accomplice. Fellow prisoners later said he prayed for his captors and comforted others who'd been condemned. When the Japanese sentenced him to death, he thanked them politely and asked that no harm come to the tribes. In September 1944, Hugh Seagram was led to a bamboo grove and executed by firing squad. Standing tall, eyes open, unblindfolded. The Karens wept for months. After the war, he was awarded the George Cross, Britain's highest civilian award for heroism. The citation called him a man of unshakable courage and Christian gentleness. Hugh Seagram didn't win his war with bullets. He won it with integrity. In the end, even his enemies respected him. And in the Burmese jungles, stories of Grandfather Longlegs are still told, not as a soldier, but as a man who chose honor over survival. Most people would quit flying after losing both legs. Douglas Bader didn't just keep flying. He went back to war, shot down German planes, and escaped from prison camps twice. Bader was born with a talent for trouble and a love for the sky. By his 20s, he was one of the Royal Air Force's most promising young pilots, fast, fearless, and way too confident for anyone's comfort.
That confidence nearly killed him. In 1931, he tried an unauthorized stunt at low altitude. His plane hit the ground, exploded, and the crash cost him both legs. Doctors said he'd never walk again, much less fly. He spent months in hospital learning to use prosthetics. 2 steel legs he called Tin Annie and Tin Liz. When the RAF forced him into retirement, he left in fury, declaring, "I'll be back in the air someday." That someday came 9 years later. When World War II erupted, Britain needed every pilot it could find. Bader showed up at headquarters, clanked his metal legs on the desk, and said, "Give me a Spitfire." The RAF hesitated until he passed every flight test with near-perfect scores. Some say he was even better than before. With no feeling in his legs, he could withstand higher G-forces in combat turns. By 1940, during the Battle of Britain, Bader was leading squadrons of Hurricanes and Spitfires into dogfights over southern England. He shot down over 20 enemy aircraft, racking up victories like a man making up for lost time. Pilots adored him. He gave pep talks with lines like, "Don't listen to excuses, never give up." He became a national hero, a living symbol of British stubbornness. Then came August 1941. On a mission over France, his plane collided mid-air with a German fighter. Bader ejected, but one of his prosthetic legs got stuck in the cockpit. He barely managed to pull free before the aircraft exploded. He parachuted down behind enemy lines, landing alive, but very much legless. The Germans captured him and, bizarrely, treated him with respect. Luftwaffe ace Adolf Galland, who'd fought him in the air, actually arranged a special airdrop so the British could deliver Bader a replacement prosthetic leg. That didn't stop him from trying to escape. Twice? The first time, he slipped through a window and nearly reached the Dutch border before being caught. The second time, he tried climbing the camp fence on his tin legs and got tangled in barbed wire, laughing at the guards as they dragged him down. Eventually, the Nazis locked him in Colditz Castle, the maximum security prison for serial escapees. Even there, he refused to sulk. He organized lectures, pranks, and escape drills for fun. When the war ended, Bader walked, or rather clanked, back into England a hero. He was knighted later for his service to disabled veterans and aviation. Douglas Bader's story isn't about flying planes. It's about refusing to accept limits. He lost his legs, but never his altitude.
In the final months of World War II, Japan's skies filled with young men who believed dying beautifully was the last duty they could perform. Among them was a boy who was barely old enough to vote, Yukio Araki, the youngest kamikaze pilot ever recorded. He was just 17. Yukio wasn't born for war. He was born for school, friends, and quiet walks with his pet dog, a little white Shiba Inu named Shiro. But by 1944, Japan was collapsing. Allied bombers were pounding cities daily, and the government turned desperation into ideology. They called it Toko, Special Attack Missions. To the world, it meant kamikaze. Volunteer pilots were told they'd save the emperor by sacrificing themselves, crashing their planes into enemy ships. To boys like Yukio, raised on obedience and patriotism, it sounded like honor. He enlisted straight from school, still small enough to look out of place in a flight suit. His instructors called him polite, quiet, and frighteningly determined. He wrote home regularly, his letters filled with gratitude and calm, the words of someone old beyond his years. In his last note, he wrote, "Dear parents, thank you for everything. Please take care of Shiro. I hope he doesn't cry too much when I am gone." It was the kind of line that breaks your heart because it's so ordinary. A boy worried about his dog, not the war. On May 27, 1945, Yukio climbed into his Mitsubishi K-51 bomber with a 500-pound bomb beneath it. The morning was gray and humid at Chiran Air Base, where kamikaze pilots took off for the Okinawa front. He bowed to his commanders, smiled for the camera. The Japanese military filmed every departure, and raised a white headband marked with the rising sun. He was seen joking with his comrades just before takeoff. He said, "Let's meet at Yasukuni Shrine, the shrine for Japan's war dead." Then his plane roared down the runway and lifted into history. He was never seen again. Allied records note multiple kamikaze attacks on that day against American ships off Okinawa. None of the young pilots returned. Yukio Araki's life ended in seconds, but his face, frozen in that final photograph, became one of the most haunting symbols of Japan's lost generation. After the war, his letters were found, carefully folded in his barracks locker. His family kept them for decades, yellowed and delicate. In them, he never mentioned glory or revenge, only gratitude, faith, and love for his dog. When veterans visited his hometown years later, they said Shiro used to run to the airfield every evening for months after Yukio's last flight, waiting for someone who would never land again. It's easy to see kamikaze pilots as symbols, brainwashed or fanatical. But Yukio's story reminds us they were also just children, caught in a storm far bigger than themselves. He didn't dream of death. He dreamed of home. And somewhere in that dream, a small dog was still waiting by the door. Everyone on the battlefield carried a weapon, but it was Desmond Doss who stood apart. He went to war without one, refused to even touch one, and still saved 75 men under enemy fire. He was the only soldier to win the Medal of Honor for breaking every rule of combat. Desmond was a quiet, skinny kid from Virginia, raised in a deeply religious Seventh-day Adventist family. He believed in two things: never kill and always help. When World War II broke out, he didn't try to dodge the draft. He volunteered. But he told the Army straight up, "I won't carry a gun." That didn't go over well. His fellow soldiers mocked him, called him a coward, even beat him during training. Commanders tried to court-martial him for refusing to bear arms. One officer told him, "You're not going to survive without a weapon." Doss just smiled and said, "Sir, I'll be the one saving yours." He became a medic, unarmed, unarmored and completely undeterred. Then came Okinawa, 1945, the battle that turned him from a curiosity into a legend. Okinawa was a nightmare, a wall of rock called Hacksaw Ridge, riddled with bunkers and machine guns. Every yard was drenched in blood. When his company was ordered to take the ridge, they climbed up under constant shelling. They made it to the top, barely, before the Japanese counterattacked. Artillery and mortars shredded the position. Soldiers screamed for medics. Everyone retreated, except Das. He stayed behind, alone. No rifle, no helmet, just a Bible in his pocket and bandages on his back. He crawled through smoke and fire, dragging wounded men one by one to the cliff's edge, tying them with ropes and lowering them down by hand. All night long, explosions lit the sky. Each time he hauled another man down, he whispered a prayer. "Lord, please help me get one more." Over and over, for hours, until his body gave out. By dawn, he had saved 75 soldiers, Americans, and even a few wounded Japanese, carrying them through gunfire that should have killed him 100 times over. When he was finally found, he was shot in the arm, hit by grenades, and barely conscious. The last man he saved before collapsing was the one who'd once called him a coward. When his commander heard the full story, he threw away the paperwork for court-martial and recommended him for the Medal of Honor. President Truman pinned it on him in 1945, saying, "You're the bravest man I've ever met." Desmond Doss never raised a weapon, never took a life, and never broke his faith. He showed the world that courage doesn't always mean killing. Sometimes it means saving. He didn't conquer the ridge with bullets or bloodlust. He conquered it with compassion. And when the smoke cleared, even the hardest soldiers on that mountain agreed, the man without a gun was the bravest one there. He didn't wait for someone to hand him a miracle weapon. He built one first, then handed it to the miracle. Tony Stein was a Marine with grease under his nails and a mind that thought, why not? When his unit hit Iwo Jima in February 1945, the island greeted them with concrete pillboxes, overlapping fields of fire, and machine guns that seemed surgically placed to ruin any forward movement. Standard rifles and grenades were good, but not always good enough. Stein had other plans. Before the invasion, he'd worked on aircraft, fixing things, swapping parts, and learning how metal and engines behaved. That mechanic's curiosity stuck with him when the fighting started. He scavenged parts from wrecked planes and stripped down an aircraft-mounted machine gun until it looked like something between a toolbox project and a lethal guitar. The result was a compact, shoulder-fired automatic weapon his buddies nicknamed the Stinger. It wasn't an official armament, it was a solution. Armed with that jury-rigged baby, Tony moved like a man with a vendetta against concrete. While others advanced under covering fire, he sprinted up ridgelines and jumped bunker lips, letting the Stinger chew through sandbags and gun embrasures. The rate of fire stunned defenders and bought his squad the seconds they needed to close and clear positions. Where grenades failed to rip open a slit in the enemy's armor, his invented gun did the talking and the smashing. He didn't just use the Stinger as a hammer, he used it as a morale engine. Men watched him pop up from behind blasted volcanic rock, spray controlled bursts into a firing slit, then sprint away with a grin like he'd just pulled a prank.
The Germans in Europe had nightmares about single tanks. The Japanese on Iwo Jima got sleepless nights about one crazy Marine and his homemade metal thunder. Beyond the gadgets and bravado, Stein's real skill was timing. He'd wait until the enemy blinked, a lull, a head peek, and then feed them a concentrated blast so precise it felt personal. He chased down snipers, suppressed machine guns, and covered the withdrawal of wounded men. Once, with ammo running low, he stripped cartridges from other weapons, kept firing until the job was done, and then scrounged more like it was an art form. On March 1st, 1945, Tony Stein did what he always did: lead from the tip. While guiding an attack on a heavily defended hill, he spotted a machine gun nest that was tearing his men apart. He charged it. He was hit. He kept going. He died there, in the middle of doing what he did best: making impossible things possible for the men behind him. After the smoke cleared, the Marines counted the cost and the courage. Tony Stein was awarded the Medal of Honor posthumously. The citation didn't mention his grin, his grease-stained hands, or the ridiculous little gun that didn't belong anywhere near doctrine, but it told the truth. He saved lives, smashed resistance, and inspired men to move when movement seemed suicidal. Tony Stein's legacy is the kind that doesn't fit neatly into manuals. A mechanic's mind, a gambler's heart, and hands that turned junk into salvation. He reminds us that sometimes bravery is not only about stepping forward, it's about looking at what you've got and saying, "That'll do," then making it do the impossible. When Hungary joined the Axis, one army officer quietly decided his real enemy wasn't outside the borders, it was inside the system. Laszlo Osztakai, a decorated Austro-Hungarian veteran, used paperwork, uniforms, and sheer nerve to turn a warehouse into a miracle. In 1944, Hungary was drowning in Nazi control. The SS and Hungarian Arrow Cross were rounding up Jews for deportation. Osztakai, now a logistics officer in Budapest, saw former neighbors and colleagues marked for death. He had no army left to command, just a storage building, a typewriter, and his reputation. That was enough. He declared that his warehouse would become a military supplier, supposedly producing clothing for the army. He filed the paperwork, stamped it, and sent it through official channels. When inspectors came, he gave tours, waved charts, and saluted so crisply no one dared question him. Behind those factory doors weren't machines, just 2,000 Jewish men, women, and children he had registered as essential workers. To keep them alive, Osztakai built an entire illusion. He trained people to sew, handed out fake ID cards, and paid bribes to keep inspectors away. German officers who visited were served coffee and told about production quotas. At night, he organized food runs, medical care, and even schooling for the children hidden inside the workforce. Every day was a performance. A single forged signature or one suspicious soldier could have ended everything. When Arrow Cross militias raided nearby buildings, Osztakai stood at the gate in full uniform, barking orders, and convinced them the factory was under his personal command. The fascists backed off. By the winter of 1945, Budapest was collapsing under Soviet siege. The city burned, supplies vanished, and starvation spread. Osztykai stayed in the warehouse until the last German troops withdrew. When Soviet soldiers finally entered, they found the people inside alive. Cold, sick, but alive. 2,000 of them who should have been ash in a camp furnace. After the war, the new communist government didn't trust him. He'd been an army colonel, after all. He faded into obscurity, dying in poverty in Vienna in 1966. His story almost died with him until survivors began to tell their children about the colonel who pretended to make uniforms. Today, Laszlo Osztykai is recognized by Yad Vashem as righteous among the nations, though his name still isn't as famous as Schindler's. He never kept lists or built factories for profit. He built one to fool a regime and buy time, one forged document at a time. He didn't carry a gun, command troops, or lead a rebellion. He just weaponized bureaucracy, courage, and compassion. In a world where the paperwork of death was perfect, Laszlo Osztykai proved the paperwork of mercy could be too.
They say an army marches on its stomach, but in one insane moment during World War II, the cook became the army. Meet Ivan Sereda, a Soviet field cook who didn't just serve stew, he served up a dozen German prisoners using nothing but an axe and unfiltered confidence. It happened in 1941, in the chaotic early months of Operation Barbarossa. The Red Army was reeling. Units were scattered, and everything that could go wrong was going wrong. Ivan Sereda was stationed near Smolensk, cooking for a tank crew when German soldiers ambushed their camp. His entire unit was wiped out in minutes. The tanks were gone, the men were dead, and standing alone in the wreckage was one very angry cook holding an axe. Now, if this were anyone else, that's where the story would end. But Sereda wasn't wired like most people. He looked at the approaching Germans, a dozen of them, and decided, all right, fine, it's just me then. He didn't charge them outright. He went for a full theater. He climbed into the wrecked Soviet tank, slammed the hatch shut, and started shouting orders like there was still a full crew inside. Reload! Fire! Cover the flank! The Germans, hearing shouting and seeing movement, thought the tank was still operational, maybe even manned by survivors. They ducked for cover. Sereda then fired the machine gun mounted on the tank, a burst of bluffing brilliance that forced the enemy to scatter. When the gun jammed, he grabbed his axe and jumped out and started swinging like a man possessed. He smashed rifles, chopped through helmets, and shouted so loudly the Germans must have thought reinforcements were coming. And here's where it gets ridiculous. They surrendered. 12 German soldiers, armed, trained, and fresh, put their hands up to a single Soviet cook covered in soot and blood, brandishing an axe like a medieval executioner. He lined them up, made them march back to Soviet lines, and handed them to stunned officers. When they asked how he'd managed it, Sereda supposedly said, they were polite enough to surrender before lunch. The Red Army immediately promoted him and awarded him the Order of the Red Banner, one of the highest military decorations in the USSR. Newspapers printed his photo with captions like, "The cook who fed the Germans fear." For the rest of the war, Sereda stayed with the Tank Corps, officially as a cook, unofficially as the guy no one messed with. He became a symbol of Soviet stubbornness, the idea that even when the army was gone, the spirit of resistance wasn't. Ivan Sereda never became a general, never commanded troops, and never wrote a memoir. But his story spread through campfire tales, proof that courage isn't about rank or training. Sometimes it's just a man, an axe, and a refusal to die quietly. When the world fell apart, the cook didn't run. He stood up, sharpened his axe, and reminded everyone that even the smallest man can change the outcome of a war if he's crazy enough to try.
Some pilots coped with fear by drinking. Others prayed. Miroslav Ferek drew cartoons. He was a Polish fighter ace who spent World War II staring death in the face every morning, and then laughing at it in the margins of his flight log. Literally. His notebooks were full of dogfights and doodles, stick figures doing barrel rolls, caricatures of his fellow pilots, and little sketches of death getting punched in the nose. It wasn't therapy, it was survival. Ferek was born in 1915, a quiet, wiry kid who grew up fascinated by the new science of flight. When Germany invaded Poland in 1939, he was already an airman, one of the few who managed to escape the slaughter. He fled across Europe, eventually joining the Royal Air Force in Britain, where the exiled Polish squadrons were forming. He was assigned to number 303 Squadron, the legendary Kościuszko Squadron, which became one of the most effective fighter units of the entire Battle of Britain. The Polish pilots were fierce, disciplined, and, to the British, a little unhinged. They fought like they had nothing left to lose, because they didn't. Their country was gone. Home was occupied. Death was just part of the schedule. And through it all, Ferek kept drawing. He filled every page of his logbook with sketches. Dogfights became comic strips. Crash landings became slapstick scenes. His doodles made the other pilots laugh, even on days when half their friends didn't come back. One of his favorite recurring characters was a little Polish eagle wearing goggles, an airborne mascot flipping off the swastika. Ferek's humor wasn't escapism, it was defiance. Every time he sketched death losing, he reminded himself and his squad mates that they could still win small victories, even in a war built on tragedy. He wasn't just an artist, though. He was a killer pilot, skilled, methodical, and shockingly calm under pressure. During the Battle of Britain, he scored 9 confirmed kills, taking down German bombers and fighters that vastly outnumbered his squadron. When asked how he did it, he said, "It's simple. I aim ahead and trust the drawing in my head." But faith doesn't care how talented you are. In February 1942, Ferek was flying a routine training mission over Northolt. His Spitfire's engine failed at low altitude. The plane spiraled and crashed before he could bail out. He was just 26 years old. When his comrades went through his belongings, they found his flight logs, dozens of pages of flying, fighting, laughing sketches. They started passing them around the base. Those little cartoons became sacred, a record of a man who'd managed to turn terror into something human. Today, Miroslav Ferek isn't remembered just as a pilot. He's remembered as the artist of 303 Squadron, the man who fought Nazis by day and made them look ridiculous by night. In a sky ruled by death, his laughter, scribbled in pencil, was an act of rebellion. Because sometimes the bravest thing you can do in war isn't to shoot first. It's to smile back at the reaper and draw him falling out of the sky.
World War II made legends out of killers, and few were as terrifyingly efficient as Mikhail Wittmann, the German tank ace whose Tiger I turned battlefields into graveyards. He destroyed 138 enemy tanks, hundreds of vehicles, and entire platoons, until the same steel monster that made him famous became his coffin. Wittmann wasn't born a warrior. He was a farmer's son from Bavaria who joined the army young, back when tanks were still new and terrifying machines. By 1941, he was commanding one, a Panzer III rolling into the Soviet Union. He quickly earned a reputation for what soldiers called nerves of iron. Where other tankers saw chaos, he saw patterns, perfect angles, ambush routes, weak spots. He didn't just shoot fast, he thought fast. But it was in 1943 when he climbed into a Tiger I, that hulking 57-ton beast of armor and cannon, that Wittmann became something else entirely, a human weapons system. The Tiger could take a direct hit from almost anything, and its 88mm gun could turn Allied armor into molten metal from over a mile away. Wittmann treated it like an extension of himself. His crew worshipped him. His enemies learned to fear his silhouette. His most infamous moment came on June 13, 1944, near the French village of Villers-Bocage, just days after D-Day. British armored divisions were advancing to cut off German reinforcements. Wittmann, outnumbered and practically alone, drove straight into their column. In less than 15 minutes, he destroyed 14 tanks, 15 personnel carriers, and 2 anti-tank guns, all by himself. Smoke and fire filled the streets as soldiers fled. Allied survivors later said it felt like being ambushed by a ghost. Wittmann's Tiger had appeared, wreaked havoc, and vanished back into the countryside. Berlin turned him into a national hero overnight. Propaganda posters called him the Black Baron. He was awarded the Knight's Cross with oak leaves and swords, the highest honor short of Hitler's personal handshake. The German public saw him as proof that one man and one machine could still turn the tide. But wars don't care about heroes. 2 months later, Wittmann led a counterattack near Saint-Agnom-de-Cramasnil, facing British and Canadian forces armed with new Sherman Firefly tanks. The Allies had learned his tactics, studied his routes, and were waiting. When Wittmann's Tiger crested a ridge, a single armor-piercing shell slammed through its hull. The tank erupted into flames. When the wreckage was found, the entire crew was ash, burned where they sat. For years, no one even knew who had fired the fatal shot. The British, Canadians, and Poles all claimed it. But in the end, it didn't matter. Mikhail Wittmann's reign ended the same way it began, in the heart of the fire he commanded. Today, historians still debate how much of his legend was propaganda. Some call him a genius tactician,
others a brutal tool of a murderous regime. Both are true. Whitman wasn't a monster or a hero. He was a man who mastered the deadliest machine of his time and paid the price for becoming one with it. He lived by the tiger's roar and, fittingly, died in its echo. Some people go to war to take lives. Frances Slanger went to war to save them, and in her final hours she wrote one of the most beautiful letters ever sent from a battlefield. Hours later, she was dead. Frances was born in Lodz, Poland, in 1913. Her family fled to America when she was a child, escaping the violence that would later consume Europe. She grew up in Boston, small, tough, and full of fire, the kind of person who'd argue with doctors twice her size if they didn't wash their hands properly. When World War II broke out, she enlisted as an army nurse. Her reason was simple. If boys my age can go, so can I. By 1944, she was serving with the 45th Field Hospital in Normandy, just behind the front lines. That meant she was close enough to hear the shells and smell the cordite. Her days were endless chains of blood, morphine, and mud. Her patients were boys barely old enough to shave, brought in screaming, broken, or already cold. She stitched, cleaned, comforted, and never complained. Then, on the night of October 21, 1944, something in her heart told her to write. Maybe she needed to put the chaos into words. Maybe she just wanted to remind herself what kindness looked like. She sat down in a tent lit by a single candle and wrote a letter addressed not to her family, not to a friend, but to the men she was treating. It began, "You GIs have no idea how much you mean to us. You are our heroes. You stand the brunt of it. We see you so often, mud, blood, and courage." She praised them not for dying bravely, but for enduring, for their jokes, their patience, the way they never complained even when half their bodies were bandaged. She thanked them for letting her and the other nurses feel part of something bigger. She ended the letter with hope that someday they'd all go home and remember that somebody believed in their goodness. She mailed it off. Hours later, just before dawn, German artillery shells rained down on her field hospital. One shell exploded near her tent. Frances Slanger was killed instantly. She was the first American nurse to die in Europe after D-Day. Her letter was published posthumously in Stars and Stripes, the military newspaper. Thousands of soldiers wrote back, not to correct her, but to thank her. Battle-hardened men who hadn't cried in years wrote that her words reminded them why they were fighting. They called her the nurse who understood. She never saw their replies, but her letter survived her, a quiet message from a war that swallowed almost everything else. No medals, no grand speeches, just one nurse, one night, one piece of paper full of compassion stronger than gunfire. Frances Slanger didn't live to see the end of the war, but she left behind something no bomb could erase, a reminder that, even in hell, someone still cared.
Some men are hard to kill. Hans Ulrich Rudol was nearly impossible.
He was the Luftwaffe's most decorated pilot and the kind of man who turned impossible missions into daily routines. Over the course of World War II, he flew over 2,530 combat missions, destroyed over 500 tanks, sank a battleship, shot down planes, and survived being shot down himself more times than most pilots flew at all. And when he finally lost a leg, he just went back to flying. Rudal began the war as a terrible pilot, so bad his instructors wanted to kick him out. He couldn't hit targets and crashed during training. But he refused to quit, drilling himself into competence through sheer obsession. By 1941, he'd earned his place as a Stuka dive bomber pilot on the Eastern Front, flying the Junkers Hu-87, a slow, screaming, dive-bombing tank killer that required nerves of steel to survive. And Rudal had steel in spades. He treated air combat like a job, not a thrill. Wake up, eat, bomb tanks, dodge flak, repeat. Every mission ended with a new crater somewhere in Russia. He became infamous among Soviet tank crews, who started spreading rumors about a German pilot who could smell armor through clouds. By the time the Battle of Kursk rolled around in 1943, Rudal was a legend. His Hu-87 was retrofitted with twin 37mm cannons, his personal tank destroyer. He'd swoop low enough to see the fear on the faces of Soviet crews, fire 2 rounds, and peel away while the tank exploded below him. His kill list climbed into the hundreds. He even destroyed the Soviet battleship Marat by diving straight at it and hitting it with a bomb that blew off its bow. But the miracle wasn't that he hit so much, it was that he lived through it. Rudal was shot down over 30 times, bailed out 6, and once crawled 9 days through the snow, half frozen, barefoot, dodging Soviet patrols before making it back to his unit. And still he kept flying. In February 1945, his luck finally ran out. Anti-aircraft fire shredded his plane. He crash-landed, his leg torn apart. Most people would have retired right there. Rudal had the leg amputated, recovered in a matter of weeks, and then requested to return to duty. He literally flew again with one leg, his prosthetic jammed under the rudder pedal. His commanding officers tried to stop him. He ignored them. By the war's end, he had destroyed 519 tanks, 800 vehicles, 150 artillery pieces, and even 1 armored train. The Soviets put a bounty on his head, dead or alive. Hitler personally awarded him the Knight's Cross with golden oak leaves, swords, and diamonds, the highest decoration in the Third Reich. It was basically the "you broke our reward system" medal. After the war, Rudal's story turned controversial. His flying skill undeniable, his politics less so. He remained loyal to the fallen regime, never renouncing it. But even his enemies admitted, as a pilot, he was unmatched. His records still stand. No pilot in history has flown more combat missions. Hans Ulrich Rudal wasn't just addicted to danger, he was danger. He didn't need 2 legs to fly, he only needed the sky to dare him again.
When the Red Army stormed through Europe in 1945, one of its toughest platoon commanders was named Yevdokim Zavony, or so everyone thought. What the soldiers didn't know was that Yevdokim was actually Yevdokia, a 17-year-old Ukrainian woman who had disguised herself as a man to fight the Nazis. And she didn't just fight. She led men into Berlin. Her story started in 1941, when the German invasion of the Soviet Union tore her village apart. She was just a teenage nurse at the time, treating the wounded on the front. One day, during an air raid, she was knocked unconscious and buried under debris. When she woke, soldiers found her ID card ruined, the name blurred and unreadable. They assumed she was male. And instead of correcting them, she went along with it. At first, she just wanted revenge. The Germans had burned her home and killed her family. But what began as fury became something much bigger. She proved herself quickly, hauling wounded men out of shell fire, dragging supplies through mud, and volunteering for every dangerous mission. No one questioned her deep voice, her short hair, or the name Yevdokim. The war didn't care about gender. It only cared about who could survive. Within months, she was fighting as a frontline soldier in the Marine Infantry, the Soviet shock troops who stormed the most fortified positions. She was promoted again and again for her courage. She led bayonet charges, captured prisoners, and once threw herself on a grenade, not to die, but to smother the blast with her coat and shield her squad. When the smoke cleared, she was alive, covered in shrapnel and still shouting orders. By 1943, she was commanding an entire platoon, all men. None of them knew she was a woman. She earned the nickname the Iron Commander, and her soldiers followed her anywhere. One later said, "He never feared death. He never took cover. We would have followed him into hell." And they did, all the way to Berlin. In the final assault, her platoon fought street by street, clearing bunkers and snipers. She was wounded several times but refused evacuation, patching herself up with morphine and cloth. When the red flag was finally raised over the Reichstag, Yevdokia Zavony, still Yevdokim to her men, stood among the victors. It wasn't until after the war, during a medical exam, that the truth came out. Her commanding officers were stunned. The soldiers who'd fought under her didn't believe it at first. Then they wept. She was awarded multiple medals for bravery, including the Order of the Patriotic War, but what she valued most was the respect she'd earned in silence. In later years, she said, "I didn't want to prove women could fight. I just wanted to stop the enemy from killing more of us." Yevdokia Zavony fought through 4 years of hell without hiding behind fear, only behind a name. She was the woman who became a legend, not because she disguised herself as a man, but because she led men better than most men ever could. In Nazi-occupied France, Frances Suttle was known by one word: prosper. It sounded like hope, and for a while, that's exactly what he was. A British secret agent dropped behind enemy lines to organize the French resistance. Suttle built one of the largest sabotage networks in Europe. But when betrayal tore it apart, and torture followed, he made one final act of defiance. He never spoke. Born in France to British parents, Suttle grew up bilingual, the perfect background for a spy.
Before the war, he was a barrister, the kind of calm, precise man who looked more suited to courtrooms than covert ops. But when the world collapsed, he joined Britain's Special Operations Executive, the SOE, the secret agency tasked with setting Europe ablaze. They trained him in everything from explosives to espionage to how to vanish in a crowd. His code name? Prosper. In 1942, he parachuted into France carrying false papers, gold, and a pistol he rarely used. Within months, Prosper's network was everywhere. Safe houses, couriers, radio operators, bomb makers. He connected resistance groups across Paris, Lyon, and the countryside, building a web of over 100 agents. They blew up trains, sabotaged factories, and guided downed Allied pilots to safety. The Gestapo called the network the Invisible Army. But as with all invisible things, one mistake made it visible. By mid-1943, the Prosper circuit was too successful, too large, too fast, too famous. German counterintelligence closed in through informants, captured couriers, and intercepted messages. Then came betrayal. A double agent exposed the network's radio codes. One by one, agents were arrested. Safe houses were raided. Suttle knew the collapse was coming, but he refused to abandon the people who trusted him. In June 1943, he was captured in Paris. The Gestapo knew exactly who he was, the man who had humiliated them for nearly a year. They wanted names, codes, drop zones, everything. They tortured him for days, electric shocks, beatings, starvation. He said nothing. They brought in his friends from the network, broken and bleeding, hoping he'd talk. He stayed silent. When they realized he wouldn't break, they tried psychological games, false promises of freedom, forged letters from London. Still nothing. Some reports say he was offered a deal, reveal his agents, and he'd live. He refused and, according to survivors, even managed to warn others not to confess through coded remarks shouted during interrogation. He was executed at Buchenwald in 1944, along with many of his captured comrades. The Prosper network died, but the resistance it inspired didn't. The fragments of his group helped pave the way for the French uprisings before D-Day, sabotaging rail lines that crippled German reinforcements. London later called Suttle's mission a tragedy, but one built on absolute loyalty. Francis Suttle's courage wasn't loud or cinematic. He didn't shoot himself out or escape in disguise. He simply refused to give the enemy his voice. In a war built on deception, his greatest weapon was truth, held behind sealed lips until the end.
Most engineers build machines to save lives. Armin Lemkool built one to end his, and then personally climbed inside to prove it worked. He was a German naval engineer during the final, desperate phase of World War II, when the Third Reich was crumbling and the Allies controlled the seas. Germany's Grand Navy, once the terror of the Atlantic, was now reduced to scraps, broken U-boats, fuel shortages, and crews too young to shave. That's when Lemkool had an idea that was equal parts genius and madness: a one-man suicide submarine.
The concept was simple in theory and horrifying in practice. Instead of sending huge, fuel-hungry submarines to attack Allied fleets, he would design tiny ones, torpedo-shaped craft that a single man could pilot straight into a target. No escape, no survival plan, just a guided missile with a human brain behind the wheel. He built the prototype himself, a sleek metal cylinder barely large enough to fit his body, equipped with primitive controls, a small periscope, and enough explosives in the nose to obliterate a destroyer. He called it an Engelshammer, Angel's Hammer. To the German Navy, it was suicide. To Lemkool, it was logical. Better one life for a ship, he supposedly told a colleague. It's the engineer's duty to test what he builds. So, when the prototype was ready, he didn't assign a pilot. He became the pilot. In late 1944, off the coast of Norway, Lemkool launched himself toward an Allied convoy. His superiors thought it was just a test. He knew better. The submarine barely had oxygen for an hour and no return route. He maneuvered through icy waters, steering by instinct, the hum of propellers echoing through the hull like a heartbeat. Allied radar detected something small but fast. Depth charges thundered above him. One shock wave nearly crushed the hull, but still he pushed forward. No one knows exactly what happened next. Some records suggest his craft struck a British freighter and detonated, sinking it instantly. Others say it vanished without a trace, the explosion never confirmed. What's certain is that Armin Lindkool never returned. After the war, Allied engineers studying captured blueprints called his invention one of the most extreme examples of technological fanaticism. But even they admitted it was brilliantly designed. The mechanism was simple, effective, and terrifyingly efficient. The Nazis would later build more one-man submarines based on his work, calling them neggers and martyrs, and sending desperate young men to die in them during the last months of the war. Lemkool's colleagues remembered him as calm, almost serene before the launch. No speech, no farewell. Just a quiet man stepping into the machine he'd created, sealing the hatch and disappearing into the sea. It's easy to see him as mad, and maybe he was, but he also embodied the tragic, twisted logic of total war, the belief that the only way to serve was to sacrifice. He didn't design a weapon, he designed a tomb, and then volunteered to prove it could kill.
If Hollywood ever wrote a movie about a man who destroyed more tanks than anyone in history, while openly hating his own officers, it would be about Kurt Knispel. He wasn't the kind of soldier Germany wanted to celebrate, but he was the kind they needed to win. Born in 1921 in what's now the Czech Republic, Knispel was a mechanic's son. Tall, wild-haired, and allergic to authority. He joined the Panzer Corps not out of ideology, but because he loved machines. When he first climbed into a tank, it wasn't patriotism that fueled him, it was curiosity and adrenaline. By 1941, as Germany invaded the Soviet Union, he was a gutter in a Panzer IV. He quickly made a name for himself by being uncomfortably good at killing other tanks. He had no formal education beyond high school, no political ambitions, and no patience for pomp. But when shells were flying, he could spot, range, and destroy an enemy tank faster than anyone in his division. His secret? He didn't rely on luck. He read the battlefield like a chessboard. As the war dragged on, Knispel transferred to the new Tiger I, the steel beast that ruled the Eastern Front. From 1943 onward, his kill count climbed to mythical levels, 168 confirmed tank kills, with another 30 or so unconfirmed, the highest ever recorded by any tanker in history. To put that in perspective, most aces celebrated if they hit double digits. Knispel was breaking records every month. But he didn't act like a Nazi poster boy. He refused promotions, skipped briefings, and often got in fights with officers who treated their crews like expendable parts. Once, he punched an SS officer for beating a Soviet prisoner, a move that could have gotten him executed. His superiors called him undisciplined. His crew called him the best damn commander we ever had. Knispel didn't care about medals. He often let others take credit for kills, saying it's the crew that wins, not the man who pulls the trigger. He wore his hair long, refused to salute propaganda officials, and ignored orders that didn't make sense tactically. But when the shooting started, everyone wanted him nearby. In April 1945, during the last gasps of the Third Reich, Knispel was fighting in Czechoslovakia, commanding a Tiger II. He engaged Soviet T-34s near Wostitz, and even then, outnumbered and outgunned, he managed to knock out several before his tank took a direct hit. He was pulled from the wreckage, mortally wounded. He was 23 years old. The Nazis never gave him the Knight's Cross, their top medal for valor, likely because of his open contempt for authority. His name was buried along with his records until decades later, when researchers found his remains in an unmarked grave near Vlasatice in 2013. Kurt Knispel wasn't a hero in the political sense. He was a warrior who hated the ideology he fought under, but still did his duty to the men beside him. He was living proof that courage and conscience don't always wear the same uniform. He died as he lived, in fire and defiance, unafraid, unbowed, and unowned by any cause but his own.
If history were a movie, Yoshiko Kawashima would be the character you couldn't quite decide was hero, villain, or myth. She was a Manchu princess, adopted by a Japanese general, who dressed like a man, commanded soldiers, seduced warlords, and died in front of a firing squad, smiling. Her real name was Aisinjoro Xianyu, born in 1907, a descendant of the Qing dynasty emperors of China. She was royalty, but in the crumbling chaos of the early 20th century, that meant nothing. When her father lost power after the fall of the dynasty, she was sent away to Japan as a political hostage and adopted by a nationalist officer, Naniwa Kawashima. He raised her like a son, not a daughter, teaching her to ride, shoot, and fight. By her teens, she was wearing male clothes, cutting her hair short, and calling herself Prince. She was everything society hated and everything the headlines loved. Yoshiko's early life was a trail of scandals, affairs, rumors of espionage, broken hearts, and whispered questions about her identity. But it wasn't until the 1930s that she became truly dangerous. When Japan invaded Manchuria, she saw an opportunity to carve out her own destiny,
by playing both sides. She offered her services to the Japanese military as a spy and political fixer, using her Manchu royal lineage to gain access to Chinese officials. Her charm and arrogance made her famous. Wearing military uniforms and pistols, she toured battlefronts on horseback, commanding small units of soldiers. The press called her the Eastern Mata Hari. The Japanese adored her. The Chinese called her a traitor. She called herself neither, only a survivor. She helped Japan install Puyi, the last emperor of China, as puppet ruler of Manchu Kuo, the Japanese-controlled state. Some say she dreamed of restoring her dynasty's glory. Others say she just wanted to prove she could control empires the same way she controlled men, through willpower and seduction. She spoke 5 languages, smoked constantly, and loved shocking people. One witness said she'd drink whiskey with generals one night and lead raids against bandits the next. But the tide of war always turns. By 1945, Japan was losing, and so was she. The Chinese caught her in Peking, disguised and desperate. Her trial for treason and espionage drew massive crowds. The prosecutors called her a traitor to her blood. Yoshiko refused to beg. She said she had simply lived by her own code, not China's, not Japan's, not anyone's. When the verdict came, death by firing squad, she didn't flinch. On March 25, 1948, she walked into a prison courtyard wearing men's clothes, smiled faintly at the soldiers aiming rifles at her, and said her final words, "I am ready." One shot to the back of the head. That was the end of Yoshiko Kawashima and the beginning of her legend. To this day, no one agrees who she truly was, spy, patriot, traitor, or freedom seeker. But one thing is certain, she lived louder than anyone else in her century, defying every rule of gender, nation, and loyalty. A princess who became a soldier, a woman who lived as a man, and a spy who never stopped performing in death.